He didn't even look at her when he said it. Edward Hargrove straightened his coat, tucked the envelope back into his breast pocket, the envelope that held every dollar she had saved for 3 years, and told the station agent in a voice loud enough for everyone on the platform to hear, "That woman is a thief. She stole from my family. Don't let her buy a ticket anywhere." Clara Whitlock stood 5 feet away and couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words hit her the way a slap hits. Not just the pain, but the shock that someone's hand had actually moved through the air toward your face. People turned. A woman pulled her child closer. A man in a brown hat stepped back like guilt was something you could catch. Edward never once looked at her. That was the part that broke something deep inside her chest. If this moment feels unbearable to you, if you're already asking yourself, what would I have done, then stay with me. Because what happened next on that platform changed 3 lives in ways none of them ever saw coming. Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to your heart, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button. Drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world to me to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that platform, because Clara's story was only just beginning. The morning had started the way all of Clara's mornings had started for the past month, with the particular kind of dread that lives not in your stomach but somewhere behind your eyes, a pressure that never quite goes away, no matter how much you sleep. She had woken before dawn in the boarding house on Merchant Street, the one with the cracked window she'd stuffed with a piece of old newspaper to keep the cold out, and she had lain there in the gray dark listening to the sounds of a town that had never quite accepted her. She was 31 years old. She did not feel 31. She felt like a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and whose arms had finally started shaking. The plan had been simple. Simple enough that she had let herself believe in it, which was her first mistake. She'd learned by now that simple plans were the ones that came apart the fastest. A letter had arrived 6 weeks earlier from a distant cousin twice removed, a woman named Ruth Alcott, who operated a dressmaking shop in a frontier town called Silver Ridge, 3 days' journey west by rail. Ruth needed an extra pair of hands. She could offer room, board, and a small wage. She had written, "Come as soon as you're able. I mean it sincerely." Clara had read that letter 4 times. She had read the words, "I mean it sincerely," and felt something unlock in her chest that she had kept very deliberately locked for a long time. She wasn't a fool. She knew that sincerity in a letter didn't always translate to sincerity in person. But she was also a woman who had exactly $11 left to her name, who had just lost her position at the milliner's shop when the owner's nephew needed work, and who had recently ended an engagement to a man named Edward Hargrove in a manner that had left her considerably worse off than she'd anticipated. The engagement was a subject she preferred not to think about at length. She had saved for the train ticket over 3 weeks, eating less than she should have, skipping the coal delivery, and sleeping in 2 dresses instead. She had packed her battered brown suitcase, the same one that had traveled with her from her family's farm in Ohio, through 2 failed attempts at city work, and into this latest chapter, with everything she owned that still had any use to it. She had said goodbye to Mrs. Prentice at the boarding house, who had pressed a hard biscuit into her hand and told her not to trust strangers west of the divide, which Clara thought was rich advice coming from a woman who charged 30 cents a week for a room with a cracked window. She had arrived at the station at 7:30 in the morning, an hour before the westbound train was scheduled to depart. She had stood in the ticket line with her money in her coat pocket, her hand resting over it. Occasionally, the way you check a wound to see if it's still there, and she had waited her turn with the patience of a woman who had learned that showing impatience only ever made things worse. She was 2 people from the window when she heard his voice. Clara. She had known, even before she turned, that the sound of her own name said in that particular tone, flat, deliberate, stripped of all the warmth it had once carried, meant that the morning was about to go very badly. Edward Hargrove was a well-built man of 35 with dark hair that was beginning to silver at the temples, in a way that had once seemed distinguished to her and now just seemed like another thing about him she had been wrong about. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. That had been one of the things that attracted her to him initially, not because she cared about fine clothes, but because she had mistaken the appearance of care for the substance of it. She had learned, slowly and then all at once, that those were 2 very different things. "What are you doing here?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement you make when you already know the answer and you're just buying yourself a moment to prepare. "I could ask you the same thing." He glanced at her suitcase, at the ticket window, at the line behind her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not quite anger, not quite satisfaction, something that lived between the two. "Running, Clara?" "I'm leaving," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He reached into his breast pocket. She watched his hand and she had a strange sensation, the kind you sometimes get when something terrible is already in motion and your body understands it before your mind catches up. That what he was about to do was going to be worse than anything she'd prepared for. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, with a deliberateness that told her he had rehearsed this moment, or something very like it. He held it up so she could see it, but he was already turning toward the ticket agent, already speaking in that carrying voice she remembered from the nights he'd held court at dinner parties and made every word sound like a verdict. "This woman," he said, "is wanted for theft. She stole $300 from my family's household accounts during the period of our engagement. I have documentation here from my father's attorney." He set the paper on the counter. "I'm asking that you refuse to sell her a ticket until the marshal has had a chance to speak with her." The line went silent. Clara felt the silence the way you feel a temperature drop, suddenly and all over your body at once. She wanted to speak. The words were there, crowding up behind her teeth. "That is a lie. That is an absolute lie. I never touched your family's money. The only money I ever had near your family was my own, and you know what happened to it." But she looked at the faces turning toward her, the faces of complete strangers who had no reason to believe her over a well-dressed man with a piece of paper, and the words didn't come. They stayed stuck. She had learned, in the years of her life that had not been gentle ones, that sometimes the truth is the one thing that can't break through a wall that's been built carefully enough. "I didn't steal anything," she finally said. Her voice was quieter than she wanted it to be. Edward tucked the paper back into his pocket. He still hadn't looked at her directly. That was the part she kept returning to later, in the days and weeks that followed. Not the accusation, not the lie, but the fact that he had done all of it while looking past her. Like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. Like the years she had spent believing he was a good man had been a conversation he hadn't bothered to fully participate in. The ticket agent, a thin man with spectacles and the expression of someone who deeply disliked being involved in other people's situations, held up both hands. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside until I'm telling you I didn't steal anything." "I understand that, ma'am, but until someone with authority, she can wait outside," Edward said pleasantly. "I don't want any trouble." She looked at him then. She looked at him with everything she had, every ounce of the anger and the grief and the humiliation that was filling her up so fast she could feel it behind her eyes. And he met her gaze for exactly 1 second before he glanced away again. And in that 1 second she saw something that surprised her. Not guilt. She'd expected guilt, or at least the performance of it. What she saw was something closer to indifference, a mild inconvenience being handled, a thing crossed off a list. That was when she understood, fully and finally, that she had never really known him at all. She picked up her suitcase. She stepped out of the line. She walked to the far end of the platform because it was the only direction available to her, and she stood there with her back to the building and her face toward the tracks. And she waited, because there was nothing else to do. The marshal arrived 20 minutes later, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who smelled of coffee and horse, and who listened to Edward's account with the patience of someone who had heard many such accounts and believed about half of them. He asked Clara questions in a tone that wasn't unkind, but wasn't particularly on her side either. She answered everything. She had nothing to hide and everything to lose, which is a terrible combination because it means you tell the truth completely and watch it not be enough. There were no witnesses who could corroborate her account. The money Edward claimed she had stolen, $300, a figure he named with the specificity of a man who had chosen it carefully, had passed through accounts she had legitimately had access to during the engagement, accounts his father had insisted she be added to for household management purposes. It looked on paper like exactly what Edward was describing. She knew it looked that way. She suspected he had made sure it would look that way. Marshal Briggs told her she was not under arrest. There wasn't sufficient cause for that, but that she ought not to leave town until the matter was properly sorted, and that could take some time. She watched the westbound train pull away from the platform at 8:47 in the morning. She stood there until it was completely out of sight, until the last trailing smoke had dissolved into the gray winter sky. And then she sat down on the bench at the far end of the platform and looked at her suitcase and thought about the fact that she had $11 in her coat pocket. No, 9. She'd spent 2 on the boarding house through the end of the week, and no room past Friday, and no prospects, and no family within 200 miles, and a piece of paper sitting in a lawyer's office with her name on it and the word theft somewhere in the vicinity of it. She did not cry right away. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried immediately. She was the kind who held it off as long as possible, who kept functioning through sheer stubbornness while the grief built up behind the wall she'd constructed, and then cried later, usually at night, usually alone, in a way that felt more like a structural failure than an emotional release. She cried now, not loudly, not dramatically. She pressed her lips together and looked at the tracks, and let the tears come down her face in the quiet, contained way she had perfected over years of practice. And she thought, this is it. This is the actual bottom of it. There is nowhere left to fall from here. She was so absorbed in the private disaster of her own thoughts that she almost didn't hear the small voice beside her. Why are you crying? She startled. She turned. Standing at a respectful but curious distance of about 2 feet was a child, a girl, 8 years old if she had to guess, with dark braids that had been done carefully but were beginning to escape their ribbons after what looked like a full day of living, and serious brown eyes that were watching her with the direct, uncomplicated concern that only children and dogs can manage without making it feel invasive. Clara wiped her face quickly. Old reflex. Never let it show. I'm not, she said. The girl tilted her head. You were. I was a little, Clara admitted. There was something about the child's straightforwardness that made pretending feel like too much effort. I'm all right. My papa cried once, the girl said, in the tone of someone sharing significant information. When Mama died, he went out to the barn and thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. She paused. Are you sad because somebody died? No, Clara said. Nobody died. She looked around for an adult who might belong to this child. She was standing somewhat apart from the small cluster of remaining people on the platform. But even as Clara looked, a man about 30 yards down the platform turned from his conversation with the station agent, and his gaze moved immediately, with the practiced swiftness of a parent who always knows exactly where his child is, to land on the girl. I was tall and lean in the way that came from physical work rather than any particular effort at it, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered enough to show character without quite losing the architecture underneath. He wore a coat that had been good quality once, and was now the kind of quality that came from taking proper care of a thing rather than replacing it. His hat was dark and straight-brimmed and pushed back slightly, and he was already moving toward them with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who didn't run unless something was actually on fire, but who also didn't waste time. Rosie, he said, arriving beside the girl, and placing one hand briefly on her shoulder in the way of a person who touched his child often and easily. What did I say about bothering people? I'm not bothering her, Rosie said without any particular defensiveness, just as a statement of fact. She was crying. I was checking. The man, her father, clearly, glanced at Clara. His eyes were the color of good dark coffee, and they took her in with a directness that wasn't rude but wasn't soft either, just honest assessment. He took in the suitcase, the red edge of her eyes, the bench at the far end of the platform where no one had come to sit with her. Clara watched him process all of it and come to some set of conclusions, and she felt, with the particular sensitivity of someone who has been looked at with suspicion recently, the difference between being assessed and being judged. This was assessment. There was no verdict in his face yet. I apologize for the interruption, he said to Clara. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who didn't fill silences unnecessarily. She wasn't interrupting, Clara said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Something shifted slightly in the man's expression. Not a smile exactly, more like the precursor to one, a small adjustment that suggested the possibility. Rosie's got a talent for finding people who need checking on, he said. It doesn't always serve her well in terms of minding her own business, but he stopped. He seemed to think about what he was saying and decide it wasn't going anywhere useful. I'm Caleb Hale, he said instead. Clara Whitlock. He nodded once, the way people nod when they've received information they're going to carry carefully. You waiting on the next westbound? She opened her mouth to say yes, out of reflex, out of the desire to seem like a person with a plan, and then she stopped. Because lying required energy she didn't currently have, and because something about this man and his daughter with her escaping braids and her serious brown eyes made the lie feel worse than the truth. I was, she said. I missed the morning train. There's been a complication. Caleb Hale looked at her for a moment. He didn't push. He didn't ask. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. Rosie, who operated on different social conventions than her father, said, "What kind of complication?" Rosie. "It's all right," Clara said, surprising herself again. "Someone accused me of something I didn't do. It's holding me here until it can be cleared up." She said it plainly, the way she might report the weather, because she had found that sometimes the plainest statement of an unbearable thing was the only way to keep it from unbearable. Rosie thought about this seriously. "That happened to my papa's horse once," she said. "Somebody said he'd kicked down the fence on purpose, but Papa said the fence was already rotted, and it wasn't his fault." Caleb closed his eyes briefly in the way of a parent receiving unexpected assistance. "That's not quite the same situation, Rosie." "It's the same in the important part," Rosie said firmly. "Someone said something that wasn't true about someone who didn't do it." Clara looked at this child. She felt something move in her chest. Not quite the warmth she'd been carefully keeping at bay, but the first small crack in the wall she'd built around it. "That's exactly right," she said quietly. Caleb Hale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the platform around them, the departing passengers, the station agent closing his window for the midday hour, the bench where a woman with a suitcase and nowhere to go was sitting in the cold. He looked at his daughter, who was looking at him with the expression she had apparently inherited from her mother, because it was the expression of someone who had already decided what the right thing was and was waiting with boundless patience for everyone else to catch up. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat. He seemed to be having a conversation with himself. "We're about to head to the dining room on Main Street for supper," he said finally, carefully, like a man choosing each word with the awareness that the words were doing significant work. "Rosie and I, it's not much. They do a reasonable stew on Wednesdays." He paused. "You'd be welcome to join us, Miss Whitlock, if you haven't eaten." Clara had not eaten since the biscuit Mrs. Prentice had pressed into her hand that morning, and even that had been eaten on the walk to the station, standing up, crumbs falling. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say thank you, but I'm fine with the particular dignity of a woman who does not accept charity from strangers, because accepting charity from strangers means admitting how badly things have gone. And she had spent a significant portion of her adult life avoiding that admission. She looked at her suitcase. She thought about the $9 in her pocket and the room she had through Friday, and the marshal's advice not to leave town, and she thought about Ruth Alcott's letter with its "I mean it sincerely" waiting somewhere in a dressmaking shop 3 days west that might as well have been the moon. "I don't want to be any trouble," she said, and heard, even as the words left her mouth, how hollow they sounded. Rosie Hale looked up at her with those serious brown eyes and said, with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned that the world doesn't always cooperate with simple logic, "You're not trouble. You're just someone who needs supper." Clara Whitlock looked at this child, this complete stranger's child who had walked up to a woman crying on a platform bench and asked why, with no other agenda than the genuine wish to know, who had just offered the most uncomplicated kindness she had received in longer than she could honestly remember, and felt the wall crack a little further. "All right," she said. Her voice was rough around the edges. "Thank you. I'd be grateful." Caleb Hale nodded once, picked up her suitcase before she could protest, and said only, "It's not far," and started walking. Rosie fell into step beside Clara and slipped her hand into Clara's without asking permission or explanation, the way children do when they have decided something is settled and commentary is unnecessary. Clara looked down at that small hand in hers. She thought, "I have nothing. I am nowhere. Someone has just spent considerable effort making sure everyone in this town believes I am a thief." She thought, "And somehow, in the last 10 minutes, 2 people who don't know me at all have treated me with more basic human decency than anyone has in weeks." She did not know, walking across that platform with a child's hand in hers and a stranger carrying her suitcase ahead of her, that the westbound train she had watched disappear into the mountains that morning was not, in fact, the train she was meant to be on. She did not know that the accusation that had felt like the end of everything was the first thread being pulled in a lie that would eventually unravel completely and spectacularly in front of the same people who had watched it be woven. She knew only that she was cold and hungry and humiliated, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, 2 strangers, one of whom was approximately 3.5 feet tall, had decided without fanfare or hesitation that those facts were sufficient reason to include her. For now, that was enough to keep walking. The stew was, in fact, reasonable. She ate it slowly, because she had learned to eat slowly when she was uncertain where the next meal was coming from, and she listened to Rosie explain with great seriousness the hierarchy of horses on the Hale Ranch, and which ones had good manners, and which ones, in Rosie's professional opinion, were showing off. Caleb ate quietly and said little, but watched his daughter with the particular focused attention of a man who was aware that moments like this one, ordinary, small, his daughter happy, and talking at a table with food in front of her, were not to be taken for granted. He looked at Clara once, over Rosie's head, when she laughed at something the child said, laughed before she could stop herself. The short, surprised laugh of someone who had forgotten for a second that laughing was something they had to choose. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with that same quiet assessment. But whatever verdict he'd been withholding when they first met, something in it seemed to have shifted. She noticed that he had ordered coffee and was letting it go cold because Rosie was talking, and he didn't want to interrupt. She noticed that when Rosie reached across the table to point at something on the menu out of habit, even though they'd already ordered, he moved his cup out of the way with a reflex so automatic he didn't even look down. She noticed that the hands wrapped around that coffee cup were scarred across the knuckles. Not violently, but with the ordinary scars of a man who worked with wood and wire and rope, who had caught his hands on things and let them heal and kept working. She did not know why she noticed these things. She told herself she was simply observing, the way a person does when they are in a strange place and have nothing else to occupy their attention. Rosie asked her, at some point between the stew and the small wedge of pie that Caleb ordered for his daughter without being asked, where she was trying to get to. Silver Ridge, Clara said. My cousin has a shop there. She offered me work. We're from near Silver Ridge, Rosie announced, as if this were a remarkable coincidence rather than the reasonably likely result of two people being at the same train station in a small frontier town. Papa has a ranch. It's got 17 horses and 4 cows and a dog named Franklin. Franklin, Clara repeated. He's named after President Franklin, Rosie said seriously, but he doesn't act very presidential. Clara looked at Caleb. Is that true? The naming, yes, Caleb said. The assessment, he tilted his head slightly. Mostly true. He's dignified when he wants to be. It was, she thought, the longest sentence he'd offered voluntarily. And there was something in the way he said it, dry, careful, like a man who had a sense of humor he kept on a fairly short leash, that told her something about him she couldn't have named but filed away anyway. The evening ended with Caleb paying for the meal before she could object and telling her, in a voice that suggested he was saying the practical thing and she shouldn't read anything into it, that the marshal's office would have a list of decent boarding houses if her current one was coming to an end. Rosie hugged her. It was fast and fierce and completely without warning, and then Rosie stepped back and looked up at her and said, I hope the complication gets fixed soon. Clara stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant with her suitcase and her $9 and the particular warm ache of a hug from a child she had known for 2 hours, and watched them walk away down the darkened street, and felt something very strange and very complicated happening somewhere in the region of her sternum. She did not know yet what it was. She would understand it later. But that understanding was still a long way off, and the night ahead was cold, and tomorrow the marshal would want another conversation, and Edward Hargrove was still in this town with his paper and his pleasant voice and his talent for looking through her like she wasn't there. She picked up her suitcase. She walked back toward the boarding house, and she thought, despite everything, despite the train she'd missed and the lies she couldn't yet disprove and the $9 that were going to run out faster than she wanted to think about, she thought about a small hand slipping into hers without being asked, and a man who let his coffee go cold so his daughter could finish talking, and a dog named Franklin who was dignified when he wanted to be. She thought, something happened today that I didn't expect. She did not know, yet, how much that was an understatement. The boarding house room was smaller than the one on Merchant Street had been, which was something Clara hadn't thought was possible. But here it was, smaller and colder, and with a window that didn't have even the dignity of a crack to stuff newspaper into, because it simply didn't close all the way at the top, leaving a thin gap through which the November air moved steadily and without apology. She had found it Thursday morning, 2 days after the platform, after a conversation with Marshal Briggs that had lasted 40 minutes and told her nothing she didn't already know, except that Edward's attorney had sent a formal inquiry to the county office and that these things took time and that she ought to be patient. She had thanked him. She had walked out. She had stood on the sidewalk outside the marshal's office and done a rapid calculation of her remaining money against the days stretching ahead of her and arrived at a number that made her feel briefly hollow behind the ribs. $7.40. The new boarding house cost 30 cents a day. She had found work, of a kind, helping the woman who ran it, a widow named Doris Langham, with the morning cleaning in exchange for the evening meal. It wasn't enough to stretch the money significantly, but it was something, and Clara had learned that something was worth considerably more than it sounded. She wrote a letter to Ruth Alcott explaining the delay. She didn't go into detail. She wrote only that there had been a complication and that she hoped to resolve it quickly and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. She sealed the envelope and addressed it and held it for a moment before she put it in the mail, because she was aware that Ruth might not wait, that a woman running a dressmaking shop on her own didn't have the luxury of holding a position open indefinitely, and that the letter she was sending might be the letter that closed the last door she'd had open. She sent it anyway. There was nothing else to do. She did not see Caleb Hale or his daughter for 4 days after the restaurant. She told herself this was fine. They were strangers who had been kind to her at a particularly low moment, which was something she was grateful for and intended to carry carefully, like you carry a thing that has some weight to it and some worth. But gratitude wasn't the same as expectation, and she had learned a long time ago that expecting people to show up a second time was the surest way to be disappointed. She was in the dry goods store on a Thursday afternoon, not buying anything, just looking, which was a habit she'd developed in lean times because looking costs nothing, and sometimes the simple act of being surrounded by ordinary things felt grounding. When she heard the bell above the door and turned and saw Rosie Hale come in with a list in her hand and the focused expression of a child who has been given an important task, Rosie looked up from the list, saw Clara, and her face did the thing that children's faces do when something pleases them, the uncomplicated, instantaneous brightness of it, the smile that doesn't calculate whether it's appropriate before it arrives. "You're still here," Rosie said, in a tone that made it sound like good news. "I'm still here," Clara agreed. Rosie came and stood beside her with the naturalness of a child who did not see why social convention should prevent her from standing next to someone she'd decided she liked. She held up her list. "I have to get flour and salt and a spool of brown thread, and Papa said not to get anything else, but he forgot to put coffee on the list. So I'm going to get that too, and tell him later." "That's a sound strategy," Clara said. "I know." Rosie studied her list seriously. "Are you better than before? You looked very sad on the platform." "A little better," Clara said, and was surprised to find it was roughly true. "Papa said you were in a difficult situation." Clara looked at her. "Did he?" "He said sometimes things happen to people that aren't their fault, and it makes everything complicated for a while." Rosie reached out and touched a bolt of blue fabric on the shelf beside them with one finger, not taking it, just touching. "He was talking about you, but he said it in the general way." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Your father is perceptive." "What's perceptive?" "It means he notices things and understands them correctly." Rosie considered this. "Yes," she said, with the decisive confidence of someone confirming a thing they already knew. "He is." She paused. "He's going to be here in a few minutes. He had to talk to the man at the feed store." Another pause, this one with slightly different quality to it. Deliberate, Clara thought, though she wasn't sure an 8-year-old was capable of deliberate pauses. "If you wanted to, you could stay and say hello." Clara looked at this child, at the innocent architecture of the suggestion, and thought, she's 8 years old and she's already managing people. "I don't want to intrude," she said. "It's not intruding," Rosie said firmly. "Intruding is when someone comes in when they're not wanted. You'd be wanted." She said it the way she said most things, as a simple statement of fact, unadorned, unapologetic. Clara stayed. Caleb arrived 7 minutes later, pushing open the door with his shoulder because his hands were occupied with a coil of rope he'd apparently already picked up from somewhere else. He stopped when he saw Clara, and there was a brief moment, just a flicker of it, half a second at most, where something moved across his face that she couldn't read at this distance, and then was gone, replaced by his usual measured expression. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Hale." He looked at Rosie, then back at Clara, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd already done, counting up the probability that this was accidental and arriving at a number too low to be convincing. He looked at his daughter. Rosie had gone back to examining her list with great attention. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor again. "How are things?" he said to Clara. "About the same," she said honestly. "The marshal says it takes time." He nodded. He set the rope coil down against the counter and turned his hat in his hands once, a brief, restless gesture she was starting to understand was his equivalent of what other men did with words. "If you need a character witness," he said, "I can speak to Briggs. I don't know you well, but I can tell him what I observed." Clara stared at him. "You'd do that." "It's not complicated," he said. "I saw how you were on that platform. I've seen people who've done something wrong and people who haven't, and there's a difference in how they carry it. You were angry and scared and humiliated." He paused. "That's how innocent people look." She didn't say anything for a moment because she was afraid of what her voice would do if she tried. "Thank you," she finally managed. That's very kind." "It's practical," he said, in the tone of someone who was more comfortable with practical than with kind. But she noticed he didn't correct the word. Rosie, who had been listening to all of this while apparently being very focused on her list, looked up at that moment. "Papa," she said, "Miss Whitlock knows how to make honey cake. She told me at supper." Clara blinked. She had in fact mentioned this. She had no memory of the precise context, but she had mentioned it. "Is that so?" Caleb said, in the voice of a man who understood perfectly well what was about to happen. "I've been trying to make Mama's honey cake for 2 years," Rosie said seriously, "and it keeps coming out flat." She looked at Clara with the directness that was becoming familiar. "Would you show me? You could come to supper and show me after." Caleb looked at Clara with an expression that said, very clearly, "You don't have to. And also, I apologize for this." Clara looked back at him. She thought about the boarding house room with the gap at the top of the window. She thought about Doris Langham's cooking, which was competent in the way that covered all the requirements without meeting any of them. "I'd be happy to," she said, "if it's not an imposition." "It's not," Rosie said immediately. Caleb picked up the rope. "Saturday," he said. "We'll be in town Saturday morning for supplies. You could come back with us then, if—" He stopped, started again. "If you haven't got other plans." She had no other plans. They both knew this. He had said it in a way that let her pretend she might. "Saturday," she said. The drive out to the Hale Ranch took the better part of an hour in the wagon, with Rosie sitting between them and providing a continuous narration of the landscape that was part explanation, part personal history, and entirely her own editorial perspective. That fence belonged to Mr. Delaney, who had 3 sons, and one of them was rude to horses. That hill was where she'd found a hawk feather 2 summers ago and still had it. That creek ran fast in spring, but Papa had never let her fall in, not even once, which she seemed to regard as an impressive professional achievement on his part. Caleb drove and let his daughter talk, and Clara sat on the other side of Rosie and felt the unfamiliar sensation of being simply present somewhere, not calculating or worrying or bracing for the next thing, just sitting in a wagon on a cold Saturday morning while a child told her about a hawk feather, and the sky above the hills was the particular pale blue that only happens when the air is very cold and very clear. She noticed Caleb glance at her once, sideways, over Rosie's head. She wasn't sure what he saw. She wasn't sure what her face was doing. She looked back at the road. The ranch was nothing like what she'd imagined, which was probably because she hadn't allowed herself to imagine it. It was a working place, not a pretty one. The kind of property that showed you immediately that every decision made about it had been practical rather than aesthetic. The barn was large and well kept. The house was medium-sized and showed evidence of competent maintenance alongside evidence of the specific kind of disrepair that happens when you're one person trying to manage too many things. A shutter on the east window was slightly off its hinge. The porch had a plank that had warped over a winter and hadn't been replaced yet. A bucket sat beside the door that probably served some functional purpose, but also just sat there. It looked like a place where someone was doing their best. She liked it immediately. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, and Rosie led her through it with the proprietary pride of a child showing someone her kingdom. The honey cake lesson lasted an hour and 40 minutes, involved 2 failed attempts before they understood that Rosie had been using too much flour, packed down in the measuring cup, not leveled, and produced, on the 3rd try, something that rose properly and smelled exactly right and made Rosie go still for a moment when she pulled it from the oven and stand there looking at it with an expression that Clara recognized as the face people make when something they've wanted a long time finally becomes real. "That's it," Rosie said quietly. "That's it," Clara confirmed. Rosie turned and looked at her with those serious brown eyes. "That's exactly what it smelled like," she said, "when Mama made it." Clara looked at this child holding a pan of honey cake that smelled like her mother, and felt something move through her chest that was not simple, that was made of several different things at once: tenderness and grief, and the particular ache of witnessing someone else's loss from the outside. She said gently, "Your mama taught you the recipe?" "She started to," Rosie said. "I was 6. She got sick before we finished." She looked at the cake again. "I kept trying to figure out what I was doing wrong." "You weren't doing anything wrong," Clara said. "It was just one small thing, an easy thing to miss." Rosie considered this. "You're good at fixing things," she said. "I'm good at some things," Clara said carefully. "I'm bad at other things." "Like what?" "Like," she thought about this honestly, "like trusting people before I understand them well enough. Like staying somewhere when leaving seems easier." She paused. "Like asking for help." Rosie seemed to file this away thoughtfully. "Papa's bad at asking for help too," she said. "He does everything himself and then he's tired and he doesn't say so." Clara looked at the doorway that led to the front of the house, beyond which she could hear the particular sounds of a man doing something practical. "Wood," she thought, a plane moving along a board. "He's fixing the porch," Rosie said, following her look. "He's been meaning to for a month. Does he know supper's almost ready?" "He'll forget," Rosie said, with the certainty of long experience. "He always forgets when he's fixing something." She looked at Clara. "You could tell him." Clara looked at the doorway. She thought about the precise social geometry of going out to a man's porch to tell him his daughter said supper was ready, in a house she'd been in for less than 2 hours. She thought about the alternative, which was standing in the kitchen waiting for Rosie to go do it, which was also fine, which was in fact the more appropriate option. She went to the porch. I was crouched over the warped plank with his coat off despite the cold, running a hand plane along the wood with the slow, focused strokes of a person doing something they know how to do. He didn't hear her immediately. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work, watching the easy economy of it, the way he didn't rush or overcorrect. "Rosie says supper's ready," she said. He looked up. He had sawdust on his sleeve and a fresh scrape along his left knuckle. Recent, still red. He looked at it briefly, with the expression of someone who has just noticed a thing that happened a while ago, and then back up at her. "How'd the cake turn out?" he said. "Well," she said, "it turned out very well." He nodded. He set the plane down and stood, and she noticed he moved without any of the performance of it. No stretching, no commentary about his back or his knees, just stood up the way people stand up when they've been crouching and have things to do next. "She's been trying to get that cake right for a long time," he said. "I know. She told me." He looked at her for a moment with that same coffee-dark assessment. "She talks to you like she's known you longer than she has." "I've noticed that," Clara said. I hope that's all right." "It's all right," he said, and the way he said it was simple enough that she believed him. He picked up his coat from the porch railing. "She doesn't do that with most people." She didn't know what to do with that, so she went back inside. Supper was the 4 of them: herself, Caleb, Rosie, and Franklin the dog, who sat at a careful distance from the table that suggested a rule existed and who watched the meal with the dignified optimism of a dog who has learned that patience sometimes works out. Clara ate a full meal for the first time since she'd arrived in this town. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because she wasn't counting the cost of it, wasn't making it last, was simply eating. Caleb asked her at some point between the main course and the honey cake what she did. Not in the dismissive way the question was sometimes asked, sizing up, measuring, but in the way of a man who was actually curious. "I've done most things," she said. "Sewing, mainly. I worked at a milliner's for 2 years. Before that, household management for a family in Cincinnati." She paused. "I can keep accounts. I can teach. I helped at a schoolroom once, covering for a teacher who was ill. I can cook." She said it without pride or apology, just inventory. "I learned things quickly." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The milliner's, you left that voluntarily?" "The owner's nephew needed work," she said. "I was the most recent hire." He nodded. He said nothing more about it, but she had the sense the information was being put somewhere. Rosie ate her slice of honey cake with such concentrated attention that she didn't speak for the entire duration of it, which Clara was coming to understand was the highest form of compliment available in this household. She offered to wash the dishes afterward, and Caleb told her she didn't have to, and she did them anyway, because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and her hands needed something. He dried them beside her without being asked, just picked up the cloth and started, standing close enough that she was aware of him without it being anything, Just two people drying dishes in a kitchen while a child put Franklin out and argued with him gently about coming back inside. "I want to thank you," Clara said, to the dish in her hands. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She set the dish down and turned to look at him directly, because she was a woman who, when she meant something, said it directly. "What you offered to speak to the marshal. You don't know me. You have no reason to put your reputation towards something that might—" "My reputation," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, dry, slightly rueful, like a man holding up a thing that has some dents in it, "is the reputation of a widower who can't always keep his shutter on the hinge. I don't think it's so fragile that one honest conversation with Briggs will break it." She looked at him. "You're not what I expected," she said, before she could stop herself. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "Someone who would feel good about helping me, who would want me to know he felt good about it." He thought about that for a moment. "I don't feel good about it," he said. "I feel like it's the appropriate thing to do. That's different." She turned that over. "Yes," she said slowly. "It is." Franklin came back inside, shook himself comprehensively near the doorway, and went to his corner with the dignity of a dog who has made his point. Rosie appeared behind him, looked at the two of them standing at the sink with the clean dishes, and said, with a satisfaction she did nothing to conceal, "Good. You're getting along." Caleb looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has seen this coming from a distance and simply hadn't been fast enough. "Time for bed," he said. "I know," Rosie said, unbothered. She came and hugged Clara again, same fierce, fast compression, the same release, and said, "You should come back and teach me the biscuits next. Mama's biscuits were also flat, and I think it's the same problem." "It might be," Clara said. Her voice did the thing again, the slight roughness at the edge of it. She was going to have to work on that. Caleb walked her back to town in the wagon because it was late and the road was dark, and he said it without making it a discussion. She sat beside him this time, without Rosie between them, and the absence of the child's narration left a silence that was, she found, not uncomfortable, just honest. The kind of silence between people who don't yet know each other well enough to fill every space but have stopped being tense about it. "The marshal said the inquiry would take 2 weeks," she said, "at some point past the creek, possibly longer." "Does he believe you?" "I think he doesn't know what to believe," she said. "He's a fair man. He's following the process." "And the money? The $300? She took a breath. "During our engagement, Edward's father added my name to a household account for running expenses. I made purchases from it, legitimate purchases, things I was specifically asked to manage." She paused. "Edward knew everything I spent. He approved it. After the engagement ended, he told his attorney I'd taken the money for myself." She felt the familiar clench of it, the anger she kept carefully managed. "He spent 6 months creating a paper trail that could be read 2 ways. Everything was technically true. The interpretation was entirely false." Caleb was quiet. "I know how it sounds," she said. "It sounds like a man who planned ahead," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." "Why did the engagement end?" It was a personal question. She noticed him notice that it was a personal question in the slight pause before he spoke. The awareness that he was asking something he might not have standing to ask, set against whatever made him ask it anyway. "I was not what I thought he was," she said carefully. "When I understood that, I gave back his ring and left." She looked at the dark road ahead. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I didn't even take anything that should have been mine." The wagon moved over a rut. The cold was proper now, and she could see her breath. "The station clerk," Caleb said suddenly. "Pearson. He's been at that station for 11 years. He keeps records of everything, every transaction, every wire, every—" He stopped. "It's probably nothing." She turned to look at him. "What?" Hargrove would have needed to send communications. To his attorney. To whoever was building this case for him. He was looking at the road ahead, thinking aloud rather than speaking to her. Pearson would have logged those wires, times, recipients. He paused. "If Hargrove started corresponding with his attorney about your supposed theft before the engagement actually ended, before you had any reason to take anything—" Clara went still. She understood what he was saying. She understood it so quickly and completely that she felt it arrive in her chest like something cold and clean. If Edward had been building this case before she ended the engagement, if he had planned it in advance, constructed the trap, and then waited for her to walk into it, then the timeline of his communications would show it. Dates didn't lie. Wires sent to an attorney about a theft that allegedly happened after a certain date, sent before that date, would mean only one thing. Pearson keeps those records, she said. Everything that goes through the wire office, Caleb confirmed. 11 years. She looked at him. He was still watching the road. She thought about the shutter off its hinge and the bucket by the door and the porch plank he'd spent a cold Saturday afternoon fixing, and she thought about a man who noticed things, who noticed that she was angry and scared and humiliated on a platform and knew what it meant. And she thought about what it meant for someone like that to have had this idea and mention it, carefully, in the dark in a wagon, on a road between his ranch and a town where she currently had $7.40. "Why are you helping me?" she said. I was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Rosie's mother," he said, "was accused of something once. When she was young, before I knew her. Something she didn't do. Nobody helped her because nobody wanted the trouble." He kept his eyes on the road. She said the thing that stayed with her was not being believed, not the accusation, being looked through. He paused. "I didn't think about it much until I watched you on that platform." Clara didn't say anything. She looked at her hands in her lap. "You should talk to Pearson," Caleb said. "First thing Monday. Tell him what you're looking for and why. He's a careful man. He'll understand what dates mean." "Will he help me?" "I'll come with you," Caleb said, "if you want." She looked at the town coming into view ahead of them. The lights of it. The small, warm squares of windows. She thought about what it would mean to find what she thought might be there. She thought about what it would mean to not find it. "Yes," she said. "I'd want that." He pulled the wagon up outside the boarding house, and she climbed down before he could help her, old habit, and then stood beside the wheel and looked up at him. "Mr. Hale." "Caleb," he said. She registered this. "Caleb." The name fit differently than the title. "Thank you. For today. For all of it." He looked at her from the wagon seat. The lines of his face in the lamplight were tired and honest and set in the particular way of someone who has survived a hard thing and not been prettied up by it. "The cake was good," he said. "Rosie's going to want to make it every week now." "That's not the worst outcome," Clara said. "No," he agreed. He gathered the reins. "Monday, 8 o'clock, outside the station." She watched him drive away. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold until the wagon turned the corner, and then she went inside, up to the small room with the gap at the window's top. And she lay down on the narrow bed with her coat still on because it was cold and she was tired, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the station clerk named Pearson who kept 11 years of records. She thought about a man who had mentioned it the way you mention a thing you've been turning over quietly, not wanting to raise false hope, not wanting to say too much. She thought, "He's been thinking about how to help me." That was a different thought from the ones she'd been having. It sat differently. It was warmer and also more frightening because hope was a thing she'd learned to be very careful with. She pulled her coat tighter. She thought about Rosie's face when she'd taken the honey cake out of the oven and recognized the smell of her mother in it. She thought, "Something is happening here that I don't entirely understand yet." She thought, "I need to be careful about what I let myself feel." And then she thought about Monday and 8 o'clock, and a man who drove her home in the dark and told her his wife had once been looked through by people who should have helped, and who was offering her carefully and without any fanfare the only thing she'd needed since she stepped off the platform, someone in her corner. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of train tracks running westward, and somewhere past the mountains, a cousin she'd never met with a dressmaking shop, and a letter that said, "I mean it sincerely." And she woke before dawn and lay still and thought about how it was possible to need one thing so badly, to belong somewhere, to be believed by someone, and then to have it arrive, not on a train going west, but in a wagon on a cold November road, offered without condition by a widower with sawdust on his sleeve, and a daughter who baked flat honey cake, and a dog who was dignified when he wanted to be. She got up. She washed her face. She went down to help Doris Langham with the morning cleaning, and she worked, and she waited for Monday. It arrived the way Mondays do, without ceremony, without the gravity the preceding days had given it, just pale winter light through the crooked window and the particular chill of a morning that meant business. She was outside the station at 7:53. She knew it because she'd checked her watch twice. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in front of her, and told herself that whatever Pearson's record showed, she had a plan now, and a plan was more than she'd had a week ago. Caleb arrived at 7:58, on foot rather than the wagon, with Franklin inexplicably at his heels. The dog had apparently decided Monday was his business too. Clara looked at the dog. The dog looked at her with the focused attention of an animal that has decided it approves of someone. "He followed me from the livery," Caleb said. "I'm not sure how he knew where I was going." "He's perceptive," Clara said. "Rosie told me." The corner of Caleb's mouth moved. "Let's go," he said. Pearson was a small, precise man of about 60, with very clean hands and the manner of someone who genuinely loved his filing system. He received them with the cautious courtesy of a person who has worked at a train station long enough to have encountered most varieties of human trouble, and who can tell, usually, whether the variety in front of him is going to be interesting or merely unpleasant. Clara explained what she needed. She explained it clearly and without embellishment, who she was, what she was accused of, and what she believed might be in the telegraph records. She said the name Edward Hargrove and watched Pearson's face go through several expressions in quick succession. "You want to see the date of his first wire to his attorney," Pearson said slowly. "Yes. Because if he sent a wire about a theft before the engagement ended, before there was any theft to report," Clara said. Pearson looked at her. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Franklin, who had positioned himself beside Clara with a dignity that bordered on editorial. He looked back at his files. "Give me 15 minutes, he said. The 15 minutes lasted about 11 years. She stood near the window and watched the platform outside and thought about Edward on this same platform, speaking to the ticket agent in his carrying voice without once looking at her, and she pressed her hands together inside her pockets and she waited. Pearson came back with a ledger book, a large one with a cracked leather spine and the particular smell of old paper. He set it on the counter and opened it to a tabbed page with the careful deliberateness of a man who has already looked at what he's about to show you and wants to prepare himself. "Mr. Hargrove sent 3 wires to an office in the city," he said. He pointed to the entries with one precise finger. The first on October the 4th, the second on October the 9th, the third, this one, on October the 17th. Clara looked at the dates. She felt the numbers arrive in her like something physical. October the 4th. She had ended the engagement on October the 12th. She had not touched the household account after October the 12th. She had not touched it after October the 8th, in fact, because she had already understood by then what she was going to do and had been careful about it. The first wire to the attorney was sent on October the 4th, 8 days before she ended the engagement, 8 days before the supposed theft had any reason to have occurred. She pressed her lips together. She put both hands flat on the counter because her legs had done a strange thing, not buckled, not quite, but gone briefly uncertain beneath her. "He planned it," she said. Her voice came out even. She didn't know how. "He planned it before I even ended things. He had already contacted the attorney." Pearson looked at her steadily. "The dates are what they are," he said carefully. Caleb was very still beside her. She could feel that stillness, the contained quality of it. A man who had strong feelings about what he was looking at and was choosing precisely how to hold them. "Can I get copies of these entries?" she said to Pearson. "I'll need to speak with the marshal about the proper process," Pearson said. "But yes, Miss Whitlock." He paused. He had the expression of a man who has been in his job long enough to see injustice wearing its ordinary clothes. "I'll speak with him today." She straightened up. She turned to Caleb. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something between anger and a satisfaction so grim it didn't look like satisfaction at all, just the particular clarity of a man who has seen the shape of a wrong confirmed and is already thinking about what you do with that. "You knew," she said quietly. "You thought this was what we'd find." "I thought it might be," he said. "I hoped." She looked at him, this man who had let his coffee go cold so his daughter could finish talking, who fixed porch planks on his own time, who drove women he barely knew home in the dark and said it wasn't complicated, and she felt something give way in her chest, very quietly, the way ice sometimes goes not with a crack but with a slow settling. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of Pearson's counter with Franklin sitting on her left foot for moral support, but it was a near thing. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Now," Caleb said, "we go see Briggs." And they did. They walked out of the station together into the pale Monday morning, and Franklin walked between them with the composed authority of a dog who knows when he's doing important work. And Clara thought, 8 days. He started this 8 days before I gave back his ring. She thought, he was never going to let me just leave. She thought, he planned to follow me wherever I went. And she felt, underneath the anger and the cold clarity of it, the particular terror of understanding that the man who had called her a thief in front of a platform full of strangers had always intended to do exactly that. That her only mistake had been believing the danger was behind her when she walked away. She did not say any of this aloud. She walked beside Caleb Hale toward the marshal's office, and she pressed the knowledge down where it could be useful instead of paralyzing, and she thought, evidence, dates, an 11-year ledger with very clean handwriting. She thought, he planned ahead, so will I. The marshal was in. The marshal looked at what Pearson had sent over with him. Caleb had suggested Pearson come directly, which Pearson had agreed to with the air of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment to be useful. And the marshal was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "This changes things considerably." Clara sat across from him with her hands folded and said, "Yes, I believe it does." Outside the window, the morning had gone properly bright, the cold kind of bright that makes everything sharp-edged and clear. She thought about a train disappearing into the mountains and an 8-year-old girl asking why she was crying, and she thought about honey cake rising properly for the first time in 2 years. She thought, not yet, it isn't over yet. Edward was still in town, still had his attorney, still had the formal inquiry sitting in the county office. Dates in a ledger were not the same as cleared. She knew that. She had not yet learned to let herself believe in things before they were certain. But the wall she'd been building around her hope, the careful architecture of it, the habit of keeping herself contained, she felt it shift. Not collapse. Just shift. The way a door moves when someone on the other side of it finally puts their hand on the handle. She sat up straight. She breathed. She thought, Monday, 8 in the morning, a ledger with clean handwriting and dates that don't lie. She thought, let's see what Edward Hargrove does now. Marshal Briggs did not move quickly. That was the thing Clara had to understand about him, and she understood it in the days following that Monday morning in his office. He was a fair man, as she'd said to Caleb, but fairness in his particular application of it meant he moved with the deliberateness of someone who had seen plenty of situations that looked clear-cut, turned complicated, and who had learned that the cost of moving too fast was usually higher than the cost of moving carefully. He looked at Pearson's ledger entries. He looked at the dates. He said the thing about this changing things considerably, and then he said he needed to verify the records through proper channels, and that he would be reaching out to the county office, and that she should give him a few days. A few days. Clara sat across from him and kept her face composed and said, "Of course." She said it the way she said most difficult things, plainly, without the performance of emotion, because the performance was expensive, and she was running low on reserve. She walked out of the marshal's office into the bright cold morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Caleb came out behind her. He stood beside her and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his way of saying quite a lot. Franklin sat on her left foot again. She looked down at the dog. "He's going to let it sit," she said. "He's going to be thorough," Caleb said. "There's a difference." "Not to me right now there isn't." I was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose not." He looked down the street at the buildings of the town going about their ordinary business. The harness maker's shop, and the dry goods store, and the hotel where Edward Hargrove was presumably still in residence. "He's still here," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "His attorney arrives Thursday," Clara said. "Pearson told me. Another wire came in yesterday." Caleb's jaw moved slightly. That was all. "Then Briggs will have both sides in one place," he said. "That might actually move things faster." She hadn't thought of it that way. She turned it over. "Or it gives Edward the chance to counter whatever the dates suggest." "He can try," Caleb said. "Dates don't argue back." She looked at him. He was still watching the street with that level gaze of his, and she thought about what he'd told her in the wagon, about his wife, about being looked through, about the thing that stays with you. She thought about a man who had carried that story for years and then handed it to her carefully on a dark November road because it was relevant, and he wasn't the kind of person who kept useful things to himself out of pride. "I need to do something," she said. "While I wait, I can't just—" She stopped. She pressed her hands together. "I'm not good at waiting without something to do." "What kind of something?" She thought about it honestly. "Edward's attorney is coming Thursday. Edward will spend Wednesday evening preparing. He's careful, and he's deliberate, and he will have an answer for the dates. Some explanation, some reframing. He's had weeks to think about this. She paused. I need to think about it too. I need to know what he's going to say before he says it. Caleb looked at her now. She saw something shift in his expression, a slight recalibration, the look of a man who has been thinking of her as someone to help and is now seeing something else alongside that. You're not just waiting for the evidence to speak for itself, he said. The evidence has to be interpreted, she said, by Briggs, by the county office, by whoever ends up in that room on Thursday. Edward is very good at interpretation. I've watched him do it. She paused. He will have an answer for why he contacted his attorney 8 days early. He'll say he had suspicions. He'll say I'd been behaving strangely. He'll say a cautious man consults his attorney when he has concerns, even before he has proof. She heard herself laying it out and felt the cold clarity of it. Not panic, not despair, just the specific dread of knowing your opponent well enough to predict his moves. And none of that will be provable as a lie. It'll just be his word against mine and a set of dates that he'll say prove caution, not premeditation. Caleb was very still. So what do you need? He said. Something that isn't just the dates, she said. Something that shows he intended this from the beginning, not caution, calculation. They stood there on the sidewalk in the cold. Franklin had given up on her foot and gone to investigate something near the base of the lamppost. The morning moved around them. A wagon going past, 2 women with parcels, the sound of someone's hammer from the direction of the new building going up on 3rd Street. His attorney, Caleb said slowly. When did Hargrove first hire him? She looked at him. What? A man who hires an attorney for a domestic dispute, a broken engagement, a theft claim. He usually engages someone he already has a relationship with, or someone local to where the problem is. He paused. Hargrove's not from here. He followed you here. His attorney is coming here Thursday, which means he hired someone local, Clara said, understanding arriving a half-second behind his words. Or he sent for someone from wherever he came from. Either way, there's a correspondence trail with the attorney's office, a fee arrangement, a date of engagement. If he engaged that attorney before October the 4th, Caleb said. She felt the thought complete itself in her chest. Then the first wire wasn't the beginning. It was already in motion. Attorneys' offices keep billing records, Caleb said, and correspondence files. He paused. I'm not saying you can get access to those, but if his attorney arrives Thursday, if Briggs brings everyone into one room, those records could be subpoenaed. She turned the word over. Briggs would have to agree that the case warrants it. Briggs looked at those dates Monday morning, Caleb said. Give him a day and a half and let him think, she breathed out. It came out shakier than she intended. You think about this like someone who's been in a legal situation before, she said. A pause. Brief but present. My father's estate, he said, in the tone of someone opening a door just far enough to acknowledge it exists. When he died, there was a dispute. A neighbor who said my father had signed something he hadn't signed. He stopped. It took 8 months, and most of what I'd saved. And in the end, the dates saved us. Bills of sale, correspondence, things my father had written down in the ordinary course of his business that proved the neighbor was lying. He looked at the hotel at the end of the street. People who build false cases don't think about the paperwork they leave behind when they build them. They're focused on the destination. They don't watch the trail. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't quite let herself look since the platform, since the wagon, since the kitchen with the honey cake and the dishes, and thought, you are a man who has been handed a genuine injustice and survived it, and the thing it taught you was to pay attention, and that is why you noticed what no one else noticed about a telegram ledger in a train station. She did not say any of this. She said, I need to write some things down. Can I? She stopped. Do you have somewhere I can work? I don't want to do this at Doris Langham's. She means well, but she has a tendency to… Kitchen table, he said immediately. You can have it as long as you need. She looked at him. I can't keep using your house. You're not using my house, he said. You're working. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved, slight, brief. Come to supper tonight. Bring what you're working on. She opened her mouth to say she didn't want to impose, and he looked at her with an expression so patient and so plainly exasperated that she stopped. All right, she said. Good, he said. And then, Franklin, leave that alone, to the dog, who had found something near the lamppost that apparently required sustained investigation, and they walked back up the street together in the pale morning cold and Clara started making a list in her head of everything she knew and everything she needed to know, and how much time she had to find the difference. She spent Tuesday at Caleb's kitchen table. Rosie was in school. There was a small schoolhouse on the edge of town, a single-room affair with a teacher named Mr. Hobbs, who was, by Rosie's assessment, satisfactory at mathematics and weak on history, and who assigned too much reading on Fridays. And Caleb was working the ranch, visible through the kitchen window at intervals, moving between the barn and the fence line with the purposeful, unhurried stride she'd come to recognize as his ordinary mode. She wrote out everything she could reconstruct, every purchase she'd made from the household account, every date she could verify, every conversation she could document. She wrote it in the clean, steady hand she'd been praised for as a girl, and never quite figured out how to leverage into anything useful, and she organized it chronologically, and she looked at it and thought, this is my account of events. It is accurate and it is detailed, and it will mean nothing without corroboration because it is mine. She needed corroboration. She thought about who else had been present during her engagement to Edward Hargrove. She thought about the household staff, a cook, a housemaid, a man who came twice a week to see to the garden. She thought about Edward's sister, Charlotte, who had been civil to her and occasionally warm in the way of a woman who had been told to be civil and occasionally let herself be more. She thought about Edward's father, who was the one who had added her name to the account, who had stood in his study and handed her a ledger and told her what he needed managed. She stopped. Edward's father. The account had been his account. He had put her name on it. He had seen every transaction. She had submitted receipts, had kept meticulous records because she was not a careless woman, and household accounts were not something she treated carelessly. He had approved everything. She had made sure of it because she had learned early in the engagement that Edward's father was the person whose opinion governed the household, not Edward, and that his approval was the thing that mattered. He had approved everything, which meant that somewhere, in whatever files an organized man of business kept, there were records of those approvals. Notes. Receipts with his signature or initials beside them. If he was the kind of man who kept that sort of thing. She put her pen down. She pressed her fingers against her lips. If she could get a message to Edward's father directly, not through Edward, not through an attorney, directly. And if he was a man of sufficient integrity to provide those records. She heard the back door open, and Caleb came in with cold air following him and went directly to the stove to pour coffee without looking at her, and then turned and looked at what was spread across his table. "Talk me through it," he said. She did. She talked him through all of it, the account, the receipts, the approvals, Edward's father. She watched Caleb's face as she laid it out, watched him listen with the focused attention of a man who doesn't interrupt when something important is being explained to him. And when she got to Edward's father, he set his coffee cup down on the counter. "You think his own father would corroborate you," he said. "I think his own father may not know what Edward's done with this," she said. "Edward is charming and careful, and he manages what people know. His father is in the city. He may have received a version of events that is edited. You want to write to him?" "I want to get a message to him before Thursday," she said. "Before the attorney is in the room and everything becomes formal, and everyone takes a position they can't step back from." She looked at the papers in front of her. If he's given the chance to understand what his son has done, if he sees the dates, the timeline, the letter I can write explaining what actually happened, a man of integrity has a choice. Before he's committed to a narrative, he has a choice. Caleb was quiet. "You're asking a father to act against his son," he said. "I'm asking a man to tell the truth," she said. "Whether he does that is his choice, but I want him to have the information to make it. And if he sides with Edward regardless, then I'm no worse off than I am now," she said, and she said it with a steadiness she mostly felt. Mostly. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing it, the odds, the risk, the possible outcomes. He was not a man who made decisions on sentiment alone. She'd understood that. He thought things through. It was one of the things about him she trusted. "Write the letter," he said finally. "Write it carefully. Show it to me before you send it." She wrote it that evening at the same kitchen table while Rosie did her arithmetic homework beside her and occasionally asked for help with a problem and occasionally asked completely unrelated questions about whether Clara thought horses had opinions about the weather, and whether the color blue tasted like anything, and what it felt like to be on a train for 3 days. And Clara answered all of them without losing the thread of the letter, because somehow Rosie's questions didn't break her concentration, they just occupied a different part of her mind, the part that was usually occupied with anxiety, and left the working part free. She showed the letter to Caleb after Rosie went to bed. He read it standing at the counter, and she watched his face and could not read it. When he finished, he set it down. "You didn't accuse him," he said. "No. You told him what happened and asked him to consider the dates." "Yes. And you asked him only to provide the receipts and approvals he personally signed." He looked at her. "Not to testify against his son. Not to make a statement. Just to provide documentation of transactions he himself approved." "That's right," she said. "He doesn't have to do anything that feels like betrayal. He just has to let the paper speak." Caleb looked at the letter again. She could see him thinking something he wasn't saying, and she waited. "You're asking him to trust you based on a letter from a woman he's only met a handful of times," he said. "He doesn't know you." "No," she said. "But he knows his son." She paused. "And I think, on some level, he knows his son." Something moved through Caleb's expression, a complicated thing, waited. "You're betting everything on that," he said. "I'm betting one letter and a stamp," she said. "It's not quite everything." He looked at her for a moment, and then he made a sound, not quite a laugh, too short and too dry for that, but something in the vicinity of one. "Send it tomorrow," he said. "First post." She sent it Wednesday morning, and then she waited again because there was nothing else to do, and waiting was the thing she was worst at and most practiced in. Wednesday passed. Thursday arrived with Edward Hargrove's attorney, a city man named Aldous Kent, who wore his coat like a statement, and arrived at the hotel with a leather case under his arm and the manner of someone who had already decided the outcome and was here mainly to formalize it. Clara saw him from across the street when she was coming back from Doris Langham's with eggs, and she watched him go into the hotel and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I was here," which meant the meeting with Briggs was coming, possibly today, possibly tomorrow, and whatever was in that leather case was going to be presented as the definitive account of what had happened. And she was going to be on the other side of it with her timeline and Pearson's dates and a letter to a man she barely knew that she'd sent 24 hours ago and might never receive an answer to. She went back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and breathed. The knock on Doris Langham's front door came at 2:30 in the afternoon. Clara heard Doris answer it, heard a low exchange of voices, and then Doris called up the stairs. "Miss Whitlock, there's a man here to see you." She thought, Briggs. She came downstairs and it was not Briggs. It was a man she recognized, barely, from 2 visits to Edward's family home during the engagement. An older man with white hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent their life in business and was not accustomed to being uncertain. He was holding his hat in both hands, which was the posture of a man who had not quite decided what he wanted from this encounter, but had come anyway because something had made him feel he ought to. Hargrove Sr., Richard Hargrove. He had come himself. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him and thought, "He got the letter yesterday. He booked passage last night. He arrived this morning." She thought, "He came before the meeting with Briggs, before the attorney had the chance to put everyone in their positions." "Miss Whitlock," he said. His voice was careful. Not warm, not cold, careful. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "thank you for coming." He glanced at Doris Langham, who was making an unsuccessful effort to appear as if she weren't listening from the hallway. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" They sat in Doris Langham's front parlor, which Doris vacated with a degree of reluctance that suggested she would be listening from the kitchen. Clara sat straight in the chair across from Richard Hargrove and folded her hands in her lap and waited, because this was his meeting, and she had already said what she needed to say in the letter. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man, she thought, who was used to reading people, who had built whatever he'd built in his life by understanding who was telling him the truth and who wasn't. She did not look away from that gaze. She let him look. "My son," he said finally, "has told me a version of events." He paused. "Your letter gave me a different version." "Yes," she said. "You're asking me to believe yours." "I'm asking you to look at the dates," she said. "I'm not asking you to take my word against your son's. I'm asking you to look at when the first wire was sent to his attorney. I'm asking you to look at the account records and tell me whether the expenses I submitted were approved by you personally." She paused. "The dates don't require you to trust me. They just require you to read them." I was quiet. He set his hat on the side table beside him with the deliberateness of a man making a decision. "I brought the receipts," he said. Clara went very still. He reached inside his coat and withdrew an envelope. Not small, not large. A practical envelope of the kind that has something real inside it. Every receipt from that account that passed across my desk, he said. Every one I initialed. Every one that came with your note attached. He held it, not yet extending it. I want to ask you something first. All right, she said. Did you know what he was doing? He said. When you ended the engagement, did you know he'd already built this case? She looked at him. She thought about how much to say and decided to say all of it. I knew something was wrong, she said. I didn't know the specific shape of it. I ended things because I had come to understand that he was not who I believed him to be. The case he built, the attorney, the theft accusation. I didn't know the extent of it until I was standing on a train platform and he said it in front of strangers. Richard Hargrove looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not simple guilt. Not something that resolved cleanly. He was a father. He had a son. Whatever he was feeling about his son was not something that was going to be settled in this parlor today, and she understood that. He told me you had been misappropriating funds for months, he said. He said he had evidence. He has dates, she said. The dates are accurate. The interpretation is false. I spent that money on what the household needed. You approved it. You initialed the receipts. She paused. Mr. Hargrove, I don't believe you knew what he was doing with this. I don't believe you would have— Don't, he said. Not unkindly, but firmly. Don't tell me what I would or wouldn't do. You don't know me well enough for that. She stopped. She folded that down. You're right, she said. I apologize. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he extended the envelope. She took it. She did not open it immediately. She held it in her lap because she was afraid of what her hands might do if she tried to open it right now in front of this man, and she needed to get through this conversation before she let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. I'm going to speak to the marshal, Richard Hargrove said, this afternoon, before my son's attorney has his meeting. He stood. He picked up his hat. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at the wall, at some middle distance that was probably his son's face. Edward is— He stopped. He adjusted his hat brim once, the same restless gesture she'd seen in Caleb, and that meant apparently the same thing in both of them. A man doing something with his hands when the alternative is doing nothing with feelings. He is my son, he said. That won't change. But what he's done here— He stopped again. That receipt file, he said, and his voice had changed register, gone flatter and older. The third one from the top. That's the October account summary I prepared myself. With my own totals. The numbers match yours, Miss Whitlock, and they don't match what he told me. He left without saying goodbye. He walked out through Doris Langham's front door and down the porch steps and up the street in the direction of the marshal's office. And Clara sat in the parlor chair with the envelope in her hands and listened to his footsteps go. Then she opened it. She sat there for a long time going through those receipts, each one in her own handwriting, with the items listed clearly and the amounts and the dates, and beside each one, Richard Hargrove's initials. Neat and dark and absolutely unambiguous. She had not stolen a single dollar. She had known that. She had always known it. But knowing a thing and being able to prove a thing are different countries, separated by a distance that sometimes takes years to cross. And she sat in that parlor and looked at the proof and felt the distance collapse. Her hands were shaking. She noticed them shaking, and she put the receipts down on the side table and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. And the shaking slowly stopped, and then she stood up. She needed to find Caleb. She found him at the livery, where he'd come to pick up the wagon. He was checking the horse's left foreleg. The animal had taken a stone yesterday, and he'd wanted to have the farrier look at it, and he looked up when she came in, and whatever was on her face made him straighten immediately. What happened? He said. She held up the envelope. He looked at it. He looked at her. He came toward her in the direct way he did most things, without performance. Richard Hargrove came, she said. He brought the receipts. She held the envelope out, and he took it, and she watched him open it with the careful hands of a man who understood what he was handling. He went through them slowly. She watched his face go through a sequence she couldn't quite read, something tightly controlled that took effort to control. He came himself, Caleb said. He's going to the marshal now, Clara said, before the attorney's meeting. Caleb looked at the receipt at the top, the October account summary, and his jaw moved once. Before his son gets a chance to set the story, he said. Yes. He handed the envelope back. He stood very still for a moment. "Is that enough?" she said. She didn't mean the receipts, she meant all of it. The dates, the receipts, the father arriving before the attorney. She meant, "Is this the thing that ends it?" He looked at her. She could see him wanting to say yes and refusing to say anything he couldn't be certain of, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He didn't offer comfort that wasn't true. It was sometimes uncomfortable, and it was always something she could rely on. "It's enough to make Thursday very different than Hargrove planned," he said. The meeting in the marshal's office was Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Clara was there at 9:45 with her timeline and the envelope and the dress she'd pressed herself in Doris Langham's kitchen that morning because she did not have many dresses and had decided that the one she wore today needed to be the good one. Caleb was there at 9:50, having apparently told the ranch hand to manage the morning without him, and said nothing about this to Clara, just arrived and stood beside her outside the marshal's door. And when she looked at him, he said, "I'm a witness to the character of the accused," in the tone of someone stating a professional capacity. She thought about arguing with him about it and decided she didn't want to. Aldous Kent, the attorney, arrived with a leather case and a look of measured professional authority that lasted until he saw Richard Hargrove seated inside the marshal's office already, at which point something happened very briefly in his expression that was the professional equivalent of stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. Edward Hargrove arrived last. She had not seen him since the platform. He was still well-dressed, still carried himself with the ease of a man who expected rooms to organize themselves around him. He walked in and his eyes found Clara first, quick, practiced, and she watched something move through his face that he covered immediately, the professional competence of a man who does not let his reactions show. He saw his father. The professional competence cracked, just at the edges, and just for a second, but she saw it. "Father," he said. The word came out slightly wrong, not the tone he'd intended. "Edward," Richard Hargrove said. His voice was level and completely empty of anything that could be called warmth, which from what Clara had observed of him was far more devastating than anger would have been. Marshal Briggs ran the meeting with the same unhurried thoroughness he applied to everything. He had Pearson's records. He had Clara's timeline. He had the letter from the county office confirming the formal inquiry. He laid them out in order and presented them without commentary and asked both parties to respond. Aldous Kent responded first. He was good at his job. Clara had expected this and was not surprised. He had a framework ready, exactly the one she had predicted to Caleb. Edward had had concerns well before the engagement ended. A prudent man consulted his attorney when he had concerns. The dates proved caution, not premeditation. He presented the case with the confidence of a man who had prepared it carefully and had, until approximately 1 hour ago, expected it to go unchallenged. He had not seen the receipts. He had not known about them because Edward had not told him about them, which Clara noted with a particular cold satisfaction, because it told her something she had suspected. Edward had not told his attorney about the approvals because the attorney would have told him that the approvals were a problem. Briggs let Kent finish. Then he looked at Richard Hargrove. Richard Hargrove set the envelope on the desk. He did it the way a man does a thing he has decided to do and has decided not to be dramatic about. Set it down flat, pushed it across the desk, and said, "Every expense Miss Whitlock made from that account was submitted to me for approval. I approved each one. The initials on those receipts are mine." He paused. "The totals on the October account summary match Miss Whitlock's records and do not match the amount my son cited in his accusation." The room was very quiet. Kent looked at Edward. Clara did not look away from that look. She watched it happen, watched the attorney's face do the rapid, controlled recalculation of a professional understanding that the foundation of his case has just been significantly altered. She watched him look at his client with a question he did not ask aloud, but that was entirely legible. Edward looked at the receipts. He looked at his father. He looked at Clara. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked at her, directly, without looking past her. She held his gaze. She thought about the platform, and the ticket agent, and the woman pulling her child away, and the man who had stepped back like guilt was contagious. She looked at Edward, and she did not flinch, and she did not look away. He looked away first. "The amount," Kent said carefully after a moment, "may need to be revisited." "The amount is false," Richard Hargrove said, not loudly, just clearly. "The amount my son cited does not correspond to what I approved. and the dates of his first correspondence with your office predate the end of the engagement by 8 days. He looked at his son then, and Clara looked away because some things are private even when they happen in a room full of people. I was not aware of those dates until yesterday. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when something true has been said in a room and everyone in the room knows it, and no one yet knows what happens next. Briggs picked up the receipts. He went through them. He looked at the October summary. He looked at Pearson's ledger page. He set them side by side on his desk and looked at them for what felt like a long time. Then he looked at Edward Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "I'm going to need a more complete accounting of the timeline you've provided." Edward opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Kent. Kent said very carefully, "My client would like a moment to consult with counsel." "He can have it," Briggs said. "Outside." They went outside. The door closed behind them. Clara sat in the remaining silence with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and Richard Hargrove across the room, not looking at anyone, and Caleb standing near the wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who is waiting for the appropriate moment to feel something and has not yet decided when that is. Briggs looked at Clara. "Miss Whitlock," he said, in the measured tone of a man choosing his words with the awareness that they are going to matter, "in light of this additional evidence, I'm suspending the formal inquiry pending further review." He paused. "That means the hold on your movement is lifted, effective immediately." She heard that. She processed it. She held very still. "That's not the same as cleared," she said. She needed to understand exactly what she was being given. "No," he said. "That takes more time. But the hold is lifted. You're free to go where you need to go." He looked at the envelope on the desk. "I'll be completing this investigation, but you don't need to wait for it here." She looked at the window. The pale November light outside. The street she'd walked every day for 2 weeks. The boarding house with the gap at the top of the window. The dry goods store where Rosie had appeared with her list. She was free to leave. She could take the next westbound train. She could wire Ruth Alcott and say she was coming. She could let this town and this street and this entire terrible chapter fall behind her and keep going west the way she'd always intended. She was free to leave. She sat there and looked at that freedom and felt it like something unexpected, not the relief she'd imagined, not the clean release, something more complicated, something that pulled in a direction she hadn't expected it to pull. She did not look at Caleb. She did not have to. She was aware of him across the room, the way you're aware of something that has weight and warmth, and she did not need to look to know that he was not going to say anything, that he was going to let this be entirely her moment to sit in, because that was who he was. "Thank you, Marshall," she said. Let me think about next steps." Briggs nodded. He stood. He went to his door and opened it, and asked his deputy to tell the parties outside that they'd resume at 1 o'clock, and that he needed lunch, and the room released from its particular tension into the ordinary afternoon. Richard Hargrove stood. He put his hat on. He looked at Clara once more, the same careful assessing look he'd had in Doris Langham's parlor, but something in it had changed. Some weight had settled in it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the position my son put you in." She looked at him. She thought about whether to say it was all right and knew it wasn't. She thought about what was true. "I know he's your son," she said. "I don't hold that against you." He nodded. He walked out. The room was quiet. Caleb came and sat in the chair Richard Hargrove had vacated, not the one across from her, but the one beside her, and he looked at the floor and then at his hands and then at her. "You're free to go," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He said nothing else. He was, she thought, one of the only people she had ever met who could sit beside someone in a significant moment and not try to shape it, not nudge it toward an outcome, not fill it with words that would make him feel better. He just sat there. She thought about Ruth Alcott's letter. She thought about Silver Ridge, 3 days west by rail, a dressmaking shop and a fresh start, and the reason she had crossed the frontier in the first place. She thought about what she had told herself she wanted. She thought about a kitchen table and a child asking whether horses had opinions about the weather. She thought about a porch plank and a shutter off its hinge and a dog named after a president who was dignified when he wanted to be. She thought about a man who had stood up on an empty platform and noticed the difference between how guilty people look and how innocent people look, and who had mentioned it to her in a wagon in the dark because he thought it might be something she needed to hear. She thought, "I came west to find somewhere to belong." She sat very still with that thought, and beside her Caleb Hale sat equally still, And outside the marshal's window, the town went about its ordinary business. And somewhere down the hall, Edward Hargrove was consulting with his attorney about a case that had just run out of its foundation. And Clara sat in the quiet and let herself feel the full, complicated weight of being free to go and not yet knowing if that was the same thing as knowing where. She did not take the afternoon westbound train. She told herself it was because she needed to gather her things from Doris Langham's, and that was true. She told herself it was because she wanted to write to Ruth Alcott before she simply arrived, and that was also true. She told herself there was no westbound departure until the following morning anyway, which was additionally true, and she arranged these truths in a neat row and looked at them and knew that none of them were the actual reason. The actual reason was sitting in the marshal's office beside her with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the floor, not saying a word. She walked back to Doris Langham's in the early afternoon with the envelope in her bag and the suspension notice from Briggs in her coat pocket, a single page, dry and official, that nonetheless felt like something she wanted to keep. And she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the gap at the top of the window and thought about what she was going to do. She had been in this room for 2 weeks. She had found, somewhere in those 2 weeks, a set of things she had not been looking for, and had not expected and did not quite know how to name. She was not a woman who moved toward things she couldn't name. She was a woman who made plans, who assessed situations, who arrived at conclusions through evidence. The evidence here was not simple. Evidence? Rosie Hale had put her hand in Clara's on a train platform without being asked. Evidence. Caleb Hale had let his coffee go cold. Evidence. She had laughed at supper, actually laughed, the surprised involuntary kind, for the first time in longer than she could honestly calculate. Evidence? She had spent 2 days working at a kitchen table that belonged to someone else, and it had felt, with a specificity that frightened her, more like working at home than anywhere she had actually lived. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was being sentimental. She was manufacturing significance from ordinary human kindness because she had been starved of ordinary human kindness for long enough that any supply of it felt extraordinary. She knew this was a thing the mind did. She knew it was not reliable. She wrote the letter to Ruth Alcott. She wrote it carefully, explaining that the matter had been largely resolved and that she hoped to be in Silver Ridge within the week, and thanking her again for her patience. She read it over twice. She sealed it. She addressed it. She held it for a moment. Then she put it on the nightstand and did not take it to the post office. Doris Langham knocked on her door at 6 o'clock to tell her supper was ready, and Clara went down and ate at the communal table with 2 traveling salesmen and a young couple who had just arrived from the east and were going further west and were clearly exhausted and a little frightened of it. And she ate Doris Langham's competent requirement meeting cooking and answered questions about the territory when the young couple asked them, and went back upstairs. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. In the morning she woke before dawn, which was also not unusual, and she lay in the thin light listening to the town find its feet, the early sounds of it, a horse, a door, someone's dog answering something in the distance. And she thought about what she wanted, not what she should want, not what made sense. What she actually wanted, stripped of the careful architecture she usually kept around her wanting. She wanted to stay. She lay with that for a while. It was not a comfortable thing to lie with. Wanting to stay somewhere required believing you had standing to stay, and she had no standing here. She was a woman who had been accused of theft, and whose name was technically still under investigation, and who had no employment and $7.40, and a room she'd been cleaning her way through. She was, in the clear-eyed accounting of it, a woman with no particular claim on this place or the people in it. Caleb Hale had been kind to her. She needed to be precise about that. He had been kind and perceptive and practically helpful in ways that had mattered more than she could easily say. He had a daughter who had put her hand in Clara's like it was the most natural thing in the world. None of that constituted an invitation to anything more than it had already been. She would be making a significant mistake if she read it as more than it was. She got up. She washed her face. She went to help Doris Langham with the morning cleaning. She was beating a rug on the back porch at 8:30 when she heard the front door and Doris's voice, and then a small voice that she knew, that she would apparently know anywhere now, with the specificity of someone who is tuned to a particular frequency. She set the rug beater down and came around the side of the house, and Rosie Hale was standing on the front porch in her school coat, with her braids already beginning to escape their ribbons and an expression of absolute mission. "Papa says I'm not supposed to bother you," Rosie said. "So this is me not bothering you, just letting you know we're going to town for supplies, And Papa says if you needed anything from the dry goods, he could save you the trip. She paused. He says he's at the livery right now. Clara looked at this child. She thought about all the things she'd been lying in bed cataloging, and she thought about what she was actually looking at, which was an 8-year-old girl who had found her crying on a platform and decided, with the simple authority of someone who hasn't yet learned to second-guess her own instincts, that Clara was someone worth walking up to. "How's Franklin?" Clara said. "He ate something in the barn yesterday that he shouldn't have," Rosie said, with the gravity of a medical professional reporting a case. "He's fine, but Papa made a face about it." "I'll walk with you to the livery," Clara said. Rosie's face did the thing, the brightness, instant and uncalculated. She went inside and got her coat and came back out, and they walked up the street together in the thin morning cold, and Rosie talked about Mr. Hobbs's Friday reading assignment and the horse with good manners who had been particularly good this week, and a girl at school named Adelaide who had very nice boots and knew it, and Clara listened and said the appropriate things and felt the particular quiet warmth of being next to someone who simply wanted her company. Caleb was at the livery. He was checking the wagon wheel. A spoke had loosened and he was fitting the wedge back. And he looked up when they came in with the level gaze she knew now well enough to read a fraction of, which was more than she could read most people's expressions and still considerably less than she understood was there. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. Rosie went immediately to say hello to the livery owner's horse. This left a brief and slightly particular silence. "How are you?" Caleb said. He said it the way he said most things, not as performance, as a genuine inquiry. "Better," she said. "I think it's still complicated." "Is the hold actually lifted?" "Yes, Briggs gave me the notice yesterday." She paused. "The investigation is still open technically, but I'm free to go." He nodded. He went back to the spoke, fitted the wedge with a mallet tap, tested the wheel. She watched him work for a moment. "I haven't left," she said. He didn't look up immediately. Then he did. "I noticed," he said. She took a breath. "I wrote to Ruth Alcott, my cousin." She paused. "I haven't sent it yet." Caleb set the mallet down on the wagon bed. He looked at her steadily. This was the thing about him. He did not help her along, did not fill the space with easier words, just waited. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." "All right," he said. She looked at the wheel, at the spoke, at the practical solidity of a thing repaired. "Is there—" She stopped, started again. She had once told him, bad at asking for help. She needed to do it anyway. "Is there work I could do?" she said. "Real work. Here. Not charity and not—" She stopped again. "Not indefinitely and not without earning it, but something that would give me reason to stay while the investigation finishes. And—" She made herself say the rest of it. "And possibly after." The livery was quiet. Rosie was murmuring something to the horse in the far stall. Outside, the town was moving through its mourning. Caleb looked at her. He had, she thought, a face that was not easy to read quickly, that required time and attention, and the willingness to be wrong in your first assessment of it. She had been studying it for 2 weeks, and she thought she was getting somewhere, but she was not certain, and she was not going to pretend to certainty she didn't have. "The ranch," he said slowly, "needs someone to manage the household accounts." He said it in the careful tone of a man who has thought about what he's going to say and is choosing the version that is most accurate rather than the version that is easiest. "I've been doing it myself since Ellen died. I'm not—" He paused. "I'm not bad at it, but I'm slow, and I make mistakes I don't catch until they've cost something." He paused again. "Rosie's reading is behind where it should be. Hobbs is adequate, but she needs more time than a full classroom gives her." Clara listened. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "It was Ellen's sewing room. It's been empty." He looked at the wagon wheel. "I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about work that needs doing." He looked back at her. "What I don't know is whether you'd want that. It's not what you were going to." She thought about Silver Ridge. She thought about a dressmaking shop and a cousin who'd written, "I mean it sincerely," and the plan she'd had when she boarded that first train. She thought about how plans were the things that came apart fastest. "I'd want that," she said. She said it quietly, and without hedging, because she was done hedging around the things she actually wanted. "I want to be useful somewhere. I want—" She stopped because the next thing was harder. She made herself say it anyway. I want to be somewhere that already feels like somewhere. And this does. She looked at him. I know that's, I know I've only been here a short time. I know it's not, it's accurate, he said, simply, without fuss. She looked at him. It does feel like somewhere, he said, even when it's inconvenient. The corner of his mouth moved, which it occasionally is. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not dramatically, not the cinematic release of a thing long held, just the quiet give of attention that has been maintained for a long time and has finally found something to rest against. I have $7.40, she said. I'm just being honest about the practical situation. I know the practical situation, he said. I've been watching you eat one meal a day at Doris Langham's table for 2 weeks. She blinked. You noticed that? I notice things, he said. He picked up the mallet and put it away with the unhurried precision of a man closing a subject. Talk to Rosie about the reading. See what Hobbs says she needs. Come to the ranch Saturday, and I'll show you the account books. He looked at her. We can work out what's fair from there. Caleb, don't thank me, he said. It's practical. She remembered telling him, the first night in the restaurant, that she was bad at asking for help. She remembered him not quite smiling. She thought about how he consistently reframed kindness as practicality, and whether that was modesty or something more protective, and she thought she understood which it was, and that it was not her place to press on it. Saturday, she said. Rosie appeared from the far stall with straw on her coat and a look of complete satisfaction. Ready, she said, to no one in particular. The 1 o'clock meeting at the marshal's office, the continuation Briggs had set for Thursday, took place without Clara present, because Briggs told her she didn't need to be there and she believed him. She spent the afternoon instead at the dry goods store with a list she'd borrowed from Rosie's school notebook and a budget she'd calculated to the cent. And she bought thread and 2 buttons and a length of calico that was on sale and had been marked down twice because of a small flaw at one edge that she could work around. And she spent the evening in her room altering the dress she'd been wearing every other day because the hem had started to go. She was good at mending things. She'd always been good at it. There was something satisfying in the specific problem of a thing that was broken in a fixable way. She heard from Briggs Friday morning. Not the formal letter she'd expected. He came himself, which surprised her, showed up at Doris Langham's door, and asked for her in a way that made Doris go silent with the effort of not showing how interested she was. He sat across from her in the parlor, the same parlor where she'd sat with Richard Hargrove 2 days ago, which was beginning to feel like a significant room. And he told her that in light of the evidence presented and following further review of Mr. Hargrove's correspondence with his attorney and the dates thereof, and given the testimony of Mr. Richard Hargrove Sr. regarding the account approvals, the formal inquiry had been closed. Closed, she said. Closed, he confirmed. Not suspended. Closed. He paused. I want to be clear about what that means, Miss Whitlock. It means we found no credible evidence of wrongdoing on your part. It means the accusation has been withdrawn and the county office has been notified. She sat with that. What about Edward? She said. Briggs's expression was the careful neutral of a lawman who is going to tell you what he can and not what he can't. Mr. Hargrove Jr. has left town, he said, as of this morning. Another pause. The county will be reviewing the circumstances of the accusation itself. Whether there are further legal consequences, he stopped. That's not my jurisdiction, but the review will happen. She thought about Edward in his good coat, looking past her on the platform. She thought about his face when he saw his father sitting in the marshal's office. She thought about the 1 second of actual eye contact between them, the indifference she'd seen there, the flat, mild inconvenience. And she thought about whether she wanted legal consequences to happen to him or whether she just wanted to never think about him again. The second one, she decided, emphatically. Thank you, Marshal, she said. He stood. He looked at her with the same careful fairness he'd applied to everything. I'll tell you honestly, he said, that I should have moved faster on those dates. I should have asked for Pearson's ledger myself earlier in the week. He wasn't apologetic exactly. He was a man who didn't do apologetic easily, but he was accurate. I'm sorry it took as long as it did. She thought about saying it was fine. She thought about what she'd told Richard Hargrove. I don't say things are all right when they aren't. It cost me some hard days, she said, but I understand you were being thorough. He nodded once. He left. She sat in the parlor for a moment. She was cleared. Completely, formally, on paper, and on record. 2.5 weeks after Edward Hargrove had stood on a platform and told a ticket agent in his carrying voice that she was a thief. She sat with it, and it was not as simple as she'd imagined it would feel. She'd imagined it would feel like a door opening. What it actually felt like was the removal of a very heavy thing she'd been carrying so long. She'd stopped noticing the weight, and the absence of it left her slightly unsteady, the way your legs feel when you've been braced against something that's suddenly gone. She went upstairs. She picked up the letter to Ruth Alcott. She tore it up. Not angrily, carefully, the way you close a door that you've decided to close. She tore it into neat pieces and dropped them in the bin and sat down and wrote a different letter, shorter. She explained that she had accepted a position in the area and would not be coming to Silver Ridge, that she was sorry for the inconvenience, and that she hoped Ruth's shop was thriving. She included a genuine wish for good health and nothing more. She sealed it and addressed it, and this time she took it immediately to the post office. When she came out, she stood on the sidewalk in the November afternoon and looked up at the sky, which was doing something complicated. Clouds coming in from the northwest, the kind that might mean snow, the light going gray and particular. She breathed it in, cold air, wood smoke, the smell of a town in the late afternoon that was someone else's town and had been for 3 weeks, and that she had just, she supposed, decided to make a different kind of claim on. The thought was large enough that she needed to do something with it. She turned and walked up the street to the telegraph office, because she had one more thing to do. She sent a wire to the attorney's office in the city. Not Edward's attorney, but a different one, a woman she'd heard of through another woman she'd once worked with, who had the reputation of being effective and scrupulous. She sent a brief wire asking about the possibility of a formal claim for damages to reputation and standing caused by a false accusation. She did not know if it would go anywhere. She knew that Edward had money and connections, and that money and connections had a way of softening consequences. But she also knew that Richard Hargrove Sr. had those same resources and had walked into a marshal's office and set a receipt envelope on a desk and said these numbers don't match, and she had learned something from that about the limits of her assumptions. She was not going to let Edward Hargrove's existence in the world cost her anything more than it already had. She was going to do what she could, in the proper channels, and then she was going to stop giving him space in her thinking. She walked back to the boarding house and told Doris Langham she would be leaving at the end of the week. Doris's reaction was more complex than Clara had anticipated. She'd expected something brisk, a nod, a practical question about settling up. What she got instead was Doris standing in her kitchen with a dish towel in her hands and looking at Clara with an expression that had some genuine feeling in it. "Where will you go?" Doris said. "The Hale Ranch," Clara said. "I have a position there." Doris was quiet for a moment. She had the look of a woman who has opinions she is deciding whether to share, which was not a look Clara usually found promising. "Caleb Hale," Doris said finally, in the careful tone of someone picking up something potentially sharp, "is a good man." "I know," Clara said. "He's also a quiet man," Doris said. "He doesn't—" She stopped. "He lost Ellen 4 years ago, and he hasn't—" She stopped again, and Clara understood that Doris Langham had lived in this town long enough to have watched Caleb Hale grieve his wife and keep his ranch running and raise his daughter and close whatever door it was that he kept closed, and that she was trying, in her brusque landlady way, to say something about that. "I'm not going there to be anything other than what he hired me for," Clara said. She said it clearly because she needed it to be clear. "Household management, Rosie's reading." She paused. "That's what it is." Doris looked at her. "That's a reasonable thing to say right now," she said. Clara looked back at her. "It is right now," she agreed. And Doris seemed to understand that this was a different statement than the first one, and she nodded and went back to her dishes. Saturday came in gray and cold with the smell of the incoming snow, and Caleb arrived in the wagon at 9 in the morning, which was the time they'd agreed on. He had Rosie with him, who had somehow gotten straw in her hair already, despite the fact that it was 9 in the morning, and he loaded Clara's battered brown suitcase into the wagon bed without comment, and they drove out to the ranch in the gray light with Rosie between them, providing the narration of the landscape that was becoming, Clara realized, familiar to her. She knew now which fence belonged to Mr. Delaney. She knew which hill had the hawk feather. She knew the creek. The room off the kitchen was small and held, still, the faint smell of someone else. Not unpleasant, just present, the way rooms hold the people who have used them the longest. There was a window that faced east and caught the morning light. There was a hook on the wall that held nothing. There was a narrow bed with a good quilt and a table with 2 drawers and a chair that was solid and plain. Rosie stood in the doorway and watched Clara look at the room with the serious assessment of a child who has been thinking about this. "I moved Mama's sewing things to the barn storage," she said. "Papa and I did it last week," she paused. "The hook is for your coat." Clara looked at the hook. She looked at Rosie. She thought about a woman named Ellen who had gotten sick before her daughter finished learning to make honey cake, and who had left a sewing room and a good quilt, and a husband who let his coffee go cold, and a daughter with escaping braids who walked up to strangers on train platforms because she had not yet been taught to look past people who were in pain. "Thank you," Clara said, "for moving those things." "It was time," Rosie said, in the tone of someone repeating something she'd heard and genuinely adopted. She looked at the room. "Do you like it?" "Yes," Clara said. "I like it very much." The account books were worse than she'd expected. Not fraudulent, not negligent, just the particular disorder of a man who was better at ranching than bookkeeping and who had been keeping records primarily so that they existed rather than because he consulted them. With the result that 3 years of transactions sat in 2 ledgers that didn't quite agree with each other and that had a habit of recording the same expense in 2 different categories depending on the month. She spread them across the kitchen table on Saturday afternoon while Caleb stood at the stove making coffee and watched her with the expression of a man who is braced for a verdict. "It's not bad," she said carefully. "It's a mess," he said. She looked up. "It's a manageable mess. The information is there. It just needs reorganizing. Can you fix it?" "Yes," she said. "It'll take me a few days to reconstruct the last year properly. After that, I can keep it current as we go." She turned a page. "You've been undercharging for the horses." He looked at her. "What?" "The last 3 sales. You priced below what the comparable animals were selling for in the county." She ran her finger down the column. "Not drastically, but you could have gotten," she calculated, "another $40 across those 3 horses." He was quiet. "Is that intentional?" she said. "Some ranchers price low as a relationship strategy, if they're selling to the same buyers repeatedly." "No," he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I don't like negotiating. I pick a number and stay with it." She looked at him. She thought about all the ways that trait probably served him well, and the one significant way it didn't. "Would you like me to handle the sales correspondence?" she said. He looked at her with the expression of someone being offered something they want and are not sure they should want. "You know horse pricing?" "I know account books," she said, "and I know how to write a letter that gets the right number without making anyone feel like they lost." She paused. "I'm told I'm better at asking when it's on someone else's behalf." He looked at her for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "Handle the correspondence." She worked at that table for 3 days straight, reconstructing the accounts with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned that the only way through a large, disordered thing was to start at the beginning and go 1 page at a time. Caleb worked the ranch and came in at midday and at supper and asked questions that were always practical and sometimes surprised her with their specificity. He didn't understand the bookkeeping, but he understood what he needed from it, and he knew how to ask for it. Rosie came home from school each afternoon and sat at the other end of the table and did her homework. And twice a week, Clara worked through the reading with her, not in a formal lesson structure, more in the manner of 2 people sitting together with a book, which was how Clara had first learned to love reading, and which she suspected was how most people actually learned rather than how they were told they learned. Rosie was not, it turned out, behind in her reading because she couldn't read. She was behind because Mr. Hobbs assigned books that bored her, and she had decided at some point that boredom was an acceptable reason not to finish a page, and no one had offered her an alternative. "You like animals," Clara said one evening in the 2nd week. "Stories about animals?" Rosie considered. "Real animals or made-up animals?" "Either." "Both," Rosie said. "I like when they talk, but I also like when they don't talk, but you still understand what they're thinking." Clara thought about this. "I have a book," she said. "It's in my bag. I've had it for years." She went and got it, a worn thing, the cover faded, that she'd been carrying since Ohio. She set it on the table. "It's about a dog and a horse and a boy who isn't very good at much but means well." Rosie looked at it. She looked at the cover with the particular evaluating squint of a child assessing whether an adult is trying to manage her. Then she picked it up and opened it to the first page. She read for an hour without stopping. Clara sat across from her and worked on the accounts and occasionally looked up at Rosie's face, which did the thing that children's faces do when they're actually reading, the slight movement of expression that follows the story, the brow, the mouth, the occasional intake of breath, and she felt something she recognized as happiness, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. It was not simple happiness. It was the kind that lives alongside an awareness of how recently things had been very different. But it was real. She had been at the ranch for 10 days when the first knock came from town. Caleb had driven in for feed and came back with a look on his face that told her something was different before he said a word. He came in the back door and set the invoice on the table and took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "What is it?" she said. "People in town are talking," he said, "about the case, about Hargrove." He paused. "Briggs apparently said something at the hardware store. Not deliberately, I think, just... It came out in conversation, about the dates, about the receipts." He paused again. "About who had been holding what up." She looked at him. "What kind of talking?" "The kind where people who said things are starting to reconsider what they said." He met her eyes. "Nettie Graham told me she was sorry for the look she gave you when it all started. She said that to my face while I was loading the feed." Clara was quiet. "3 other people mentioned it," he said. "The barber. The woman who runs the dry goods. Old Pearson himself said he wanted to send a formal letter of apology. He looked it up, apparently. He wants to apologize in writing." She thought about those faces on the platform. The woman who pulled her child away. The man who stepped back. The ambient judgment of a community that had no reason to believe her over a well-dressed man with a piece of paper, and that had made its choice accordingly. She thought about what it meant that they were reconsidering. "I don't need their apologies," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "But you're going to receive them." He paused. "People here they're not bad people. They made a bad call with bad information." He looked at her. "This is a small place. You're going to be living near these people." "I know," she said. I don't hold it against them." She said it and was surprised to find it was mostly true. "I know how it looked. I know I would have been suspicious too if I'd been standing on that platform looking in instead of standing in it looking out." She paused. "I just don't need the ceremony of it." "You're going to have to take it anyway," he said, gracefully. She looked at him. "Is that advice or a warning?" "Both," he said, and turned back to the door. The apologies came over the following week. Some in person, some in notes left at the ranch. Nettie Graham's was first and longest and most genuine. The barber's was brief and heartfelt in the specific way of a man who had probably rehearsed it 3 times. Pearson's letter was formal and correct, and she kept it because there was something in its careful precision that she found moving, the earnestness of a man who had wanted to do the right thing and believed in doing it in writing. She accepted them all. She said thank you and I understand, and she meant both. She did not say it's all right, because it hadn't been, and these people were not Doris Langham asking a polite social question, and they deserved her actual response. It was in the middle of this week, a Wednesday afternoon, that she came into the kitchen from the east room where she'd been working and found Caleb sitting at the table with what was clearly a letter in his hands and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He turned the letter over, face down, a reflex rather than a deliberate concealment. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's from Richard Hargrove," he said. She went still. He turned the letter back over. He held it out to her. She crossed the kitchen and took it and read it standing at the table. It was short, 4 paragraphs, the handwriting of an older man who had learned to write formally and did it automatically. He wrote to inform her that Edward had returned to the city. He wrote that he had engaged his own attorney regarding the matter of the false accusation and that he believed she would receive a formal communication within the month regarding a settlement. He wrote that he had spoken to the relevant people at the county office and that her name had been formally and completely cleared in their records. And then, in the 4th paragraph, in slightly different handwriting, as if he had set the pen down and picked it up again, he wrote, "My son is not a bad man. He is a man who makes himself into a small person when he is frightened, and when Clara Whitlock left him, I believe he was frightened. That does not excuse what he did. I am not writing to excuse it. I am writing because I knew, when I sat down to that desk and looked at those receipts, that I had helped him build this situation by not asking hard questions earlier. I am sorry for my part in it. She deserved better than what this family gave her." Clara set the letter on the table. She stood with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Caleb said nothing. He was watching her with the attention she had come to count on. present, not pressing. He apologized, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Yes, Caleb said. He didn't have to write that, she said. He could have just... The settlement communication is enough legally. He didn't have to explain. No, Caleb agreed. He didn't. She looked at the letter. She thought about Richard Hargrove's face in Doris Langham's parlor, the careful, assessing look of a man sitting with something heavy. And she thought about what it cost a father to put those words on paper about his own son. She thought about the phrase he makes himself into a small person when he is frightened. And she thought about Edward's face in the marshal's office, the 1 second of eye contact. And she thought that Richard Hargrove knew his son better than she had, and that what he'd written was probably true. It didn't make Edward's actions acceptable. It made them explicable, which was not the same thing but was something. Are you all right? Caleb said. She thought about it honestly. I think so, she said. I think I need a minute. Take it, he said, and got up and went out to the barn, and she stood at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and held the letter and let herself feel the full weight of the last 3 weeks. The platform, and the train leaving, and the bench at the end of the platform, and a small hand slipping into hers, the boarding house, and the marshal's office, and the ledger, and the receipts, and now this letter from a man she barely knew who had done the hard right thing and then told her why. And she stood there until the weight of it shifted from something she was carrying to something she had carried, past tense, the way very heavy things eventually become past tense if you stay upright long enough. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her pocket. She went to start supper. She was halfway through the soup when Rosie came home from school with a paper in her hand and the barely contained energy of someone who has been waiting to share something since approximately 2 o'clock. She set the paper on the table. It was a composition, 2 pages in her careful but not quite controlled handwriting, and looked at Clara with barely managed neutrality. Mr. Hobbs marked it, she said, in case you want to see. Clara dried her hands and picked it up. At the top, in Mr. Hobbs's red ink, excellent work, much improved. And beside that, a small star. Rosie was watching her with the intensity of someone pretending not to watch. Clara set the paper down. Rosie, she said, that is very good work. The pretending dissolved. Rosie picked up the paper and looked at the star, and then looked at Clara with an expression that was trying to be modest and was not quite making it. And Clara thought, there it is. That is the face that makes everything worth it. Not the cleared name, not the settlement communication, not Richard Hargrove's letter, though all of those mattered, but this, a child with a red ink star who wanted to show her. Can we read tonight? Rosie said. Yes, Clara said. Go change your coat. Supper first. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later and sat down, and they ate around the same table where Clara had spread the account books, and Rosie had read for an hour without stopping, and the conversation moved the way it had started to move, unevenly, comfortably, with gaps that didn't need filling and laughter that didn't need explaining. And Clara sat at her end of the table and looked at Caleb across the dishes and the lamp and the soup and thought, this is the thing I couldn't name when I first got here. This is what it is. He looked up and caught her looking. She didn't look away. He didn't either. Something passed between them that neither of them named, because some things are named later, when there's time, when the ground is steadier. Right now there was soup and lamplight and a child showing off a red ink star and a dog watching with dignified optimism from his corner. And that was, Clara thought, more than enough for tonight. She picked up her spoon. She ate her supper. She was home. The settlement communication arrived on a Tuesday in late December, 3 weeks after Richard Hargrove's letter, in an envelope with a city postmark and the name of a law firm, printed in the upper left corner in the precise serif type of people who wanted you to understand they were serious. Clara opened it at the kitchen table after Rosie had gone to school, and Caleb was out on the fence line, and she read it twice because the first time she read it, she thought she'd misunderstood the number. She hadn't misunderstood it. She set the letter down and looked at the window, the east-facing one that caught the morning light, and sat with the number for a while. It was not a fortune. It was not the kind of money that changed the fundamental shape of a life. But it was enough to matter, enough to represent something concrete and official, the law's best attempt to put a dollar amount on what it costs a woman to be publicly called a thief by a man who planned it in advance. She thought about what to do with it. Not in an abstract way. She was not a woman who dealt in abstractions when she could deal in specifics. She thought practically. which was the only way she knew how to think about money. She had her wages from the ranch, which Caleb paid her on the first of the month with the same no-ceremony directness he applied to everything. An envelope left beside the account books, the correct amount, no discussion required unless she wanted to have one. She had the accounts in order now, 3 years of disorder reconstructed into a clean record that told her exactly where the ranch stood and how it was trending, and the trend was better than Caleb had apparently understood it to be, because he hadn't been looking at it correctly. She thought about the settlement money for 2 days before she mentioned it to Caleb. She mentioned it on a Thursday evening after supper, after Rosie had gone to bed, and they were sitting in the front room with the wood stove going and the particular quiet of a house at the end of a working day. She had been working on correspondence at her end of the settee, a letter to a buyer in the next county about the spring horse sales. And Caleb had been reading something, or pretending to read something, in the way he had sometimes of holding a book and thinking about something entirely different. The settlement came, she said. He looked up. He had known it was coming. She'd told him about the letter from Hargrove's attorney, but she hadn't mentioned the amount. She told him the amount. He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "It's an estimate," she said. "The real cost is harder to calculate." "Yes," he agreed. He looked at the book in his hands, then at her. "What will you do with it?" She had been thinking about this for 2 days, turning it in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking at what's underneath. "Part of it goes to savings," she said. "I've never had actual savings. The kind that sit there and don't get touched unless something specific happens." She paused. "Part of it? I want to expand the schoolroom." He looked at her. "What schoolroom?" "The one Mr. Hobbs teaches in," she said. "It's one room for 32 children. He can't give adequate attention to the ones who are falling behind because there are too many and not enough space." She had been thinking about this since October, since the first time Rosie had come home with a composition that should have had guidance it didn't have. "There's a piece of ground beside the building. The county owns it. I checked." She paused. "If there were a second room and a second teacher, the older children could be separated from the younger ones and both groups would benefit." Caleb was very still in the way he got when something had surprised him, and he was deciding how to respond to being surprised. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Thinking about it," she said. "It's different." She set the letter down. "I know it's not my money to make large decisions with. I know it just arrived." "It is your money," he said. "Completely." "I know, I just—" She stopped. "I want to say it out loud before I do it. To someone whose opinion I trust." He looked at her across the quiet room. The fire made a small sound. Outside, the December wind moved against the window. "Do it," he said. She looked at him. "Just like that." "You've thought it through," he said. "You checked the county records. You understand what Hobbs needs." He turned his book over in his hands. "What do you need from me? My permission?" "No," she said. "Your—" She thought about the right word. "Your witness. That I said it out loud and meant it." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she was better at reading now, after 2 months, than she had been at first. She still wasn't expert at it. She thought she might never be fully expert at it, that his face was one of those things that would always require continued attention, and that this was not a problem, but a feature. "I'm witnessing it," he said, simply, the way he said most things. She went to the county office the following week. She brought her careful notes and her specific proposal, the ground dimensions, the estimated building costs she'd gotten from the same carpenter who'd fixed a neighbor's barn the previous fall, the argument for how the separation of age groups would benefit student outcomes. She presented it to the county clerk, a man named Aldridge, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who had heard many proposals and funded very few of them. She told him she would fund the building herself if the county would deed her the use of the ground and commit to funding a second teacher's salary going forward. Aldridge looked at her notes. He looked at her. He said he would take it to the board. The board met 2 weeks later. Clara was not invited to the meeting. It was a procedural reality of how the county did things. And she spent the day of it working on the spring horse correspondence and trying not to think about what was happening in the county building across town. Rosie came home from school and immediately understood, from some combination of Clara's face and the lack of conversation, that something important was pending. "Is it the schoolroom thing?" Rosie said. Clara looked at her. "How do you know about the schoolroom thing?" "Papa told me," Rosie said. "He didn't mean to, I asked him why you'd been writing so many letters to the county, and he made a face and then told me. She set her school bag down. I think it's a good idea. Thank you, Clara said. Adelaide's little sister is in the young group, Rosie said, and she can't read yet and she's 7. Mr. Hobbs says she's slow, but I don't think she's slow. I think she just doesn't get enough turns. She looked at Clara with the direct assessment that was becoming, over these months, less startling and more simply Rosie. When you teach me, you give me all the turns. Clara sat with that for a moment. That's the thing about having one student, she said. Exactly, Rosie said. So you should have a room with fewer students. The county board approved the proposal on the last day of December. Aldridge sent a letter that arrived on January 2nd because county boards did not conduct official business on the last day of December. And Clara read the approval over breakfast and said nothing about it until after Rosie had gone to school because she wanted her response to it to be her own response, undiluted, before it became something she shared. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the morning light and the remains of breakfast, and she let herself feel it. The particular satisfaction of something she had thought of and argued for and funded and seen come to exist that had not existed before she decided it should. She was not a person who had been given many opportunities to do that. She thought it was possibly the most professionally satisfying thing that had happened to her, which was a strange realization given the decade of millinery work and household management and accounting that had come before. But there it was. Caleb came in from the morning feed and poured coffee, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. He set it down. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she had learned to recognize over these months. Something he was deciding whether to say. She had learned to wait for it, not to fill the space. You should be proud of that, he said. Not just practical about it. Actually proud. She looked at the letter. I'm working on it, she said. He made a sound, not quite the laugh, the short, dry thing she'd come to look for. I know, he said. Take your time. Construction on the second schoolroom began in February, during a week of unusually mild weather that the carpenter, a taciturn man named Holt, described as lucky and then immediately refused to trust. Clara drove into town twice a week to check the progress and answer Holt's questions, which were always practical and never more than 2 at a time, because he was a man who believed in solving one problem before generating the next one, and she found she liked him very much. Rosie came with her on Saturdays. She treated the construction site with the proprietary interest of someone who had personally advocated for it and considered herself a stakeholder, which she was, and Holt tolerated her presence with the gruff patience of a man who had daughters and knew how to operate around focused females. Is the window going to be bigger than Mr. Hobbs's window? Rosie asked him one Saturday in March, while he was fitting the frame. Same size, Holt said. Rosie considered this. Could it be slightly bigger? Holt looked at Clara. Clara looked at the window frame. How slightly? She said. That was how the second schoolroom ended up with a window 6 inches wider than the first. Clara paid the difference out of her own pocket and did not mention it to the county board. Caleb heard about the window from Rosie and said nothing about it to Clara directly, but that evening he brought in firewood without being asked. He usually waited until she asked because he was a man who respected other people's organization, and set it in the box by the stove and said, while his back was turned, "The window is a good call. Light matters in a schoolroom." I know, she said. He turned around. He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was his version of saying something important without saying it directly. You're good at this, he said. At what specifically? At knowing what people need, he said, and finding the practical way to give it to them without making them feel managed. He paused. Rosie needed the turns. Holt needed someone who asked practical questions. The board needed someone who came with numbers, not feelings. He put his hand on the doorframe. That's not a common thing. She looked at him. She thought about what to say to that and decided on the thing that was most true. I learned it from being on the wrong end of it, from people who gave me the feeling without the practical. He nodded. He understood that. Still, he said, it's yours now. It doesn't matter where it came from. She thought about that for a long time after he left the room. Spring arrived and the ranch came alive in the way of working places in spring, not beautifully, not cinematically, but with the demanding and sometimes overwhelming momentum of everything that needs doing at once after the long pause of winter. The horses were in high demand, and the correspondence she'd been managing through the winter paid off in March, when 3 buyers from neighboring counties came to look, and all 3 left with animals at prices. She'd negotiated through 2 months of carefully worded letters that never quite said what they were worth until the buyer had already decided he wanted them. Caleb watched the 3rd buyer drive away with a bay gelding and stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets and said, "You got 40 more than I would have." 45, she said. He looked at her sideways, the corner of his mouth. "I like horses," she said. "That one in particular. I wasn't going to let him go for less than what he was worth." "You have a preference for the bay." "I have a preference for all of them," she said. "I've learned their names." He looked at her. "All 17? 18 now," she said. "The gray foal." I was quiet for a moment. They stood at the fence in the March wind with the sound of the ranch around them, the particular alive sound of a working place in spring, and she thought about how different this was from the bench at the end of the platform. How different she was, in ways she could feel more than she could name. Not healed, that was too clean a word, too complete. More like someone who had been repaired where she was broken and was now carrying the evidence of the repair as part of the structure, the way mended things are sometimes stronger at the seam than they were before. She was not the same woman who had stood on that platform. She was not trying to be. Caleb said, without looking at her, "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it right, so give me a minute." She went still. He was quiet for the minute he'd asked for. She waited, because that was what you did. "When Ellen died," he said, "I decided that what I owed Rosie was stability, that the best thing I could give her was a ranch that worked, and a father who was present, and didn't go looking for things that might—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself I wasn't lonely. That wasn't—" He turned the thing in his hands, something he was thinking about rather than something physical. "That wasn't entirely accurate." She looked at the fence. She breathed. "What I mean to say," he said, "is that you've been here 5 months, and the ranch runs better, and Rosie reads and I don't have to cook on Thursdays, and those are all true things, but they're not—" He stopped. "Those aren't the only things that are true." She looked at him. He was looking at the fence, at the horses, at something in the middle distance that was probably easier to look at than her face right now. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. She thought about all the ways she had been wrong about people. She thought about the cost of that wrongness, the specific, documented, attorney-verified cost of having trusted someone who was not what she believed. She thought about what it had taken to come back from that, not just the legal part, but the interior part, the part you couldn't present to a marshal or prove with a telegram ledger, the part where you decide whether to keep the door open or close it for good. She thought about a man who had let his coffee go cold. "I know," she said. "I know those aren't the only things that are true." He looked at her with the directness he used when something mattered, and he wasn't going to look away from it. "Are you—" He paused. "Is this something you want? Not just the ranch and the work. This." He said the last word with a simplicity that meant everything he wasn't listing. She thought about what she'd told Doris Langham. "I'm not going there to be anything other than what he hired me for." She thought about how true that had been at the time, and how much had changed in 5 months of supper tables and account books and the east-facing window and learning all 18 horses by name. "Yes?" she said. "It is." He nodded. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, in the tone of a man who had said the significant thing and was now returning to the world of practical considerations, "The gray foal needs a name." She looked at him. She felt something warm and slightly ridiculous rise in her chest. The kind of feeling that happens when a serious moment tips into the ordinary in exactly the right way. "Does he?" "Rosie's been lobbying," Caleb said. "She wants to call him something presidential." "Of course she does. I told her Franklin was already taken." "What's she proposing?" "Jefferson," he said. "Or Madison. She's undecided." Clara looked at the fence. She looked at the horses in the paddock, at the gray foal who was testing his legs with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of something very new to the world. "Madison," she said. "Why Madison?" "I don't know," she said. "He looks like a Madison." Caleb considered the foal. "He does, actually," he said. She told Rosie at supper. Rosie received the name with the solemn satisfaction of a child whose opinion has been consulted and validated, and then said, "I'm going to teach him things." "What kind of things?" Caleb said. "Important things," Rosie said. "Things a presidential horse should know." She applied herself to her supper with the air of someone who has made a decision and considers the matter settled. Clara looked at Caleb over Rosie's head. He was already looking at her. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing. The second schoolroom opened in April. There was no ceremony. The county board was not given to ceremony. But on the first Monday of the month, Mr. Hobbs divided his 32 students into two groups by age, and the younger 16 filed into the new room with the wider window, and a young woman named Miss Alderton, who Hobbs had trained himself over the winter. Clara had recommended her to Aldridge. She was the daughter of the harness maker, and was patient and quick and genuinely liked children, sat down at the front of the room and said good morning. Clara stood outside the building and listened to the two classrooms come alive simultaneously. The particular sound of 32 children becoming 32 students, the shuffle and settle of it, and then Hobbs's voice and Miss Alderton's voice, and then the voices of children beginning to work. And she stood in the April morning and thought, I made this happen. This didn't exist and I made it exist. She was not good at accepting that thought yet. She was practicing. Rosie came home that afternoon and said Miss Alderton had given Adelaide's little sister 4 turns, and the girl had read an entire sentence correctly and looked like she hadn't known that was something she could do. That's everything, Clara said. I know, Rosie said. That's exactly what I said. What Clara hadn't expected, what she'd thought about practically but hadn't fully felt in advance, was what the town's response would be to the schoolroom. She had done it, in some private accounting of herself, as a practical solution to a problem she'd identified. She had not done it to change how people thought about her. She had not done it to earn anything from anyone. But it did change things. Not immediately, and not in a way that was made explicit. No one said we think better of you now, because that would have required an acknowledgement of having thought less of her before, which people who have behaved badly are rarely willing to formalize. What happened instead was quieter and more genuine. The harness maker stopped her on the street to say his youngest daughter loved her new teacher. Nettie Graham, whose formal apology had been the most heartfelt, began waving when she saw Clara coming, rather than waiting for Clara to wave first. The barber, the one whose apology had been brief and rehearsed, held the door of the dry goods store for her one afternoon and said, without preamble, My son's in Miss Alderton's class. He came home Friday and read to me from a book, first time. He looked at the ground and then at her. So, thank you. She said, Thank Miss Alderton. I did, he said. She said to thank you. She walked away from that conversation and turned the corner and stood for a moment against the side of the building in the spring air and thought about what it meant to be known somewhere, not just tolerated, not just accepted on a trial basis. Known. What you'd done and what you were continuing to do. She had spent a long time believing that belonging to a place required being born to it or buying into it, in some way she couldn't afford, or winning it through a performance of adequacy she was never quite sure she was delivering. She understood now that she'd been wrong about that, or not entirely wrong, but wrong about the terms. You didn't buy belonging. You earned it the way you earned most things that mattered, by showing up and doing the work and being honest about both your capacity and your limits, for long enough that the people around you began to rely on the fact of you. It took time. It was not clean. Some people in that town would always associate her name, in the far back rooms of their memory, with the word thief, and the day a man in a good coat had said it in a carrying voice on a platform. She knew that. She was not naive enough to think time erased things entirely. But she was also here. She was at the kitchen table in the mornings, and the school board meetings in the second month of spring, and the fence-line conversations with Caleb about the horses, and the account books that she kept in the clean, organized system she'd built from 3 years of his disorder. And she was at the supper table every night where a child read to her from a worn book about a dog and a horse and a boy who meant well, and all of that was also true, and it was more of the truth than the other part. June arrived, and with it a letter she hadn't expected. It came from a woman named Mabel Finch, who was on the county school board, a position Clara hadn't known women could hold in this county until Mabel Finch had apparently made the point herself some years earlier, and the board had decided the argument wasn't worth having. Mabel Finch wrote to ask if Clara would be willing to speak at the county education meeting in July about the second schoolroom model, whether she thought it could be replicated in other small settlements in the county that had similar population to classroom ratios. Clara read the letter 3 times. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. She brought it to supper. She set it beside Caleb's plate because that was what she did now, brought things to the table, the literal table, because it had become the place where things got decided and discussed and turned over and looked at from different angles by people whose opinions she trusted. Caleb read it while Rosie explained to Franklin why presidential horses needed a different training approach than regular horses, which Franklin appeared to accept. He set the letter down. "Will you do it?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I've never—" She paused. "I've never spoken publicly like that, in a formal capacity." "You spoke to the county board," he said. "That was a proposal to two men in an office," she said. "This is a meeting." "Yes," he said, "with people who want to hear what you have to say." He looked at her. "That's different from the board because it's easier, not harder." She thought about it. "I'd have to prepare." "You prepare for everything," he said. "That's not a barrier, that's your method." Rosie looked up from Franklin's ongoing education. "Are you going to be a speaker?" she said. "Possibly," Clara said. "Adelaide's mother is a speaker," Rosie said. "She spoke at the church social about the importance of vegetable gardens, and people listened the whole time. She appeared to regard this as the relevant benchmark. You're better at talking than Adelaide's mother." "How would you know that?" Clara said. "Adelaide's mother uses a lot of long words that don't mean much," Rosie said, with the authority of someone who had been practicing reading and now had opinions about language. "You use short words that mean what they say." Clara looked at Caleb. He was looking at his daughter with the specific expression of a man who has raised someone who occasionally says things he wishes he'd thought to say. "Write back," he said to Clara. "Tell her yes." She wrote back. She told Mabel Finch yes. She spent 2 weeks preparing. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after Rosie was in bed and worked on what she wanted to say, and twice she read early drafts aloud to Caleb, who sat on the other side of the table and listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, and then with specific observations that were always useful and never flattering in the sense of being dishonest. "That part in the middle," he said, after the second draft, "where you explain the cost breakdown. It's accurate, but it's not why anyone cares." "The board will care," she said. "The board already approved it," he said. "The people in that room care about the children. Lead with the children." She looked at her draft. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said, and she threw her pen cap at him, which she had not anticipated doing, and he caught it without looking up, which she also had not anticipated. And they looked at each other across the table for a moment in the particular way that had become. Over 6 months of suppers and account books and fence-line conversations, and one December evening by the wood stove, entirely its own language. The July meeting was held in the county hall, a larger room than she'd spoken in before, with 30-some people seated in rows and Mabel Finch at the front with the brisk authority of a woman who runs meetings the way ships are run. Clara sat in the front row and looked at her notes and felt the specific cold of public speaking nerves, which she had been told would go away once she started, and which she did not fully believe. They did not entirely go away once she started, but they changed, became something she was working with rather than against, a particular alertness rather than fear. She spoke for 15 minutes. She talked about Rosie first, not by name because Rosie was not a prop for her story, but about a child who had been told she was behind and who had not been behind, who had simply not been given enough turns. She talked about what it costs a community when its children learn to believe the problem is them rather than the system. She talked about the window that was 6 inches wider than regulation and what it let in. She talked about what it meant to identify a problem and solve it, because you were the person there, the person who could, and how that was not a complicated principle even when the execution was. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of people deciding what they just heard. And then Mabel Finch started the applause, and it went around the room properly. After the meeting, a woman about Clara's age came up to her, a woman with the practical, no-nonsense clothing of someone who worked a farm, and the direct gaze of someone who had been thinking while Clara spoke. She put out her hand and said, "I'm Margaret Dunn. I have a settlement about 40 miles north, 1 room, 41 children, 1 teacher who is doing his absolute best, and it is not enough." She looked at Clara steadily. "Will you come and look at it and tell me what you told this room?" Clara looked at her hand. She shook it. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." She told Caleb that evening. They were on the porch, the one with the fixed plank, the one that had been fixed 6 months ago, and that she'd watched him fix without knowing yet what the next 6 months were going to be. and the July evening was warm and still, and the horses were quiet in the paddock. He listened. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. 40 miles, he said. I'd be gone 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. He looked out at the paddock. I can manage Rosie, he said. And the accounts won't fall apart in 3 days. I know, she said. I'm not… She paused. I'm asking if you think I should go. He looked at her. I think you already know the answer to that. I want your opinion anyway. You should go, he said. Obviously. He looked back at the paddock. You're going to end up doing this more than once, more than twice. He said it as an observation, not a complaint. She thought about that. Is that all right with you? He turned his head and looked at her with the full directness she'd learned was his version of saying something very clear. Clara, he said, you just told a room full of people that the principle is simple. Identify the problem, be the person who can, do the thing. He looked at her steadily. You identified that the county has a problem. You can do something about it. He paused. Why would I ask you not to be who you are? She sat with that. She looked at the evening sky, at the particular shade of blue that came just before the light left, and she thought about all the things she'd been told, at various points in her life, that she was or wasn't capable of, suited for, allowed to want. She thought about a man who had built a case in advance because he had known, on some level, that she was going to leave, because she was going to understand eventually who he was. She thought about what it meant to be with someone who looked at the thing you were and said, why would I ask you not to be it? Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she meant it. You're welcome, he said. Matter of fact, as if it were easy, which for him it apparently was, and she thought that said more about him than anything else had. They sat there while the light finished going. After a while, Rosie appeared at the screen door in her nightgown. She was supposed to be in bed and knew it, but she was also 9 now, and 9-year-olds had thoughts about bedtime that 8-year-olds did not, and said, Is it finished? The meeting? It's finished, Claire said. Did people listen? They listened. Rosie leaned against the doorframe with the satisfied look of someone whose confidence has been validated. I knew they would, she said. You say things that mean what they say. She looked at her father. Papa, I can't sleep. Try harder, he said. I tried already, she said. Can Clara… Yes, Clara said. Go back inside, I'll come. Rosie disappeared. Clara stood up from the porch step, and Caleb reached out and caught her hand, just for a moment, just a brief warm press of it, and let it go. She went inside. She went up to Rosie's room, which she knew now the way she knew all the rooms, the creak of the second floorboard, the hook where Rosie's school coat hung at a slight angle because she never put it on straight, the quilt that matched the one in the east-facing room because Ellen had apparently made them at the same time. She sat on the edge of Rosie's bed, and Rosie got under the quilt and looked up at her with serious eyes. Clara, she said. Are you going to stay? Clara looked at her. She thought about the bench at the end of the platform. She thought about $7.40 and a letter she'd held and then torn up, and a room off the kitchen with an east-facing window and a hook for her coat. She thought about 18 horses and their names and a ledger she'd reconstructed from disorder and a schoolroom with a window 6 inches wider than regulation. She thought about a hand pressed briefly in the warm evening and let go. Yes, she said, I'm going to stay. Rosie nodded once, with the nod of someone receiving a confirmation of what they already knew. Good, she said. Franklin will be glad. He gets anxious when people he likes go places. Then I'll stay for Franklin, Clara said. You can stay for us too, Rosie said. If you want. Clara looked at this child, who had walked up to a stranger crying on a platform bench and asked why, who had said, You're not trouble, you're just someone who needs supper, who had handed her a book about a dog and a horse and a boy who meant well and changed everything by doing it, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened since that November afternoon, the whole long, complicated thread of it, not resolved into something simple but held, all of it held, in the shape of the life she was now living. I want, she said. Rosie pulled the quilt up and closed her eyes with the immediate decisiveness of a child who has said what she needed to say and is done with wakefulness. Clara sat for a moment longer, then stood and went to the door. She paused there. The house was quiet around her, the good quiet of a place at the end of a day that has been fully used. She could hear Caleb moving in the kitchen below, the ordinary sounds of it, A cup set down, a chair, the stove door. She had arrived on a platform with a battered suitcase and a lie someone else had told in $9 and the particular despair of a person who has run out of contingencies. She had not been looking for any of this. She had been looking for a dressmaking shop in a town called Silver Ridge, and a cousin who meant it sincerely, and a fresh start, which sounded simple until you understood that fresh starts are not given to you. They are built, piece by piece, out of the materials available, which are sometimes not the materials you planned for. The materials she'd been given were a train platform and an 8-year-old who asked why, and a man who noticed the difference between guilt and innocence, and a ledger with 11 years of clean handwriting and a window 6 inches wider than it needed to be. You worked with what you had. You showed up. You did the work. You said the true thing when the easy thing was available. You let people help you even when asking for help felt like admitting something you hadn't wanted to admit. You fixed the accounts and taught the reading and made the honey cake rise and wrote the letters and spoke the words in rooms full of people who were listening. And somewhere in the doing of all of that, the place you were doing it from became the place you were from. That was not a clean story. It was not the story she would have written for herself if someone had handed her a pen at the beginning. It was the one she had. She went downstairs. She went into the kitchen where Caleb was finishing the last of his coffee at the table where the account books sat in their clean order and the book about the dog and the horse was on the corner where Rosie had left it. And she sat down across from him and he looked at her and she looked at him and neither of them said anything for a moment because some moments are full enough without words. Then he said, "Coffee?" "Please," she said. He got up and got her a cup and sat back down. And they sat together at the table in the late evening, and the house held them, and the ranch was quiet outside, and somewhere in the paddock. Madison, the gray foal, was learning what kind of world he'd arrived in, and it was not a perfect world, and it was not a simple one, and it was, for the first time in long